Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of what if Naruto was in RWBY and made a big family. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and also go and support the author, link in description. John Arc had something of a morning routine in Beacon. It was a very nice routine. Yes, he rather liked his routine. He liked it a lot. Practice makes perfect, after all. And he had put more practice in than any one of sisters. His fist sliced through the mist, shedding droplets of sweat into the emerald forest as it went. Even as they flew free, he spun and scythed a shoe through them, rendering each so much steam with the coming dawn. He let momentum carry him forward into the next blow, turning what should have been a simple punch into a devastating right hook that birthed a mighty shockwave in its wake. Left, now. Right again. Left once more. Left, 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 right, left one last time. All the while he kept his shoulders squared and his fists up as he pummeled his target. The poor tree never stood a chance. Bark burst beneath his fist. Leaves soared into the air, only to be snatched up by the wind and flown away. As to the rest. Oops. He frowned at his handiwork, mildly distressed by the state of the once towering oak. 1 hour till sunrise. No one to pester him. No one to bother him. No one to see just how powerful he really was. But it wasn't good enough. Control. He had to stay in control. Well, it wasn't like anyone would miss a few trees down here. That was the 5th tree he'd demolished tonight. And he hadn't even taken his weights off. Oops. You're wrecking the forest. The young man flinched, shoulders bowing a bit beneath his uncle's words. That said, you are getting better. Kurama's admonishment was lighter than usual. You really think so? Considering your weights are still on, you haven't used a single shadow clone since you got here and you're not using any of the gates. Yeah. His words drew a flush of pride to his face. That said, I think that's enough time down here for now. Better get back before the sun rises. Wouldn't want Yacht team to notice your little nighttime excursion. John craned his gaze back, regarding the cliffs. Ansel had raised him well. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy and wise. John subscribed to that simple philosophy more than most. After all, said saying applied almost perfectly to Dad. Who said the son couldn't emulate the father? Why not him? Naruto Arc had taken a tiny border town in the middle of nowhere and turned it into a thriving village. With next to no resources at hand, a fragmented memory, and a wounded body, he'd done the impossible. Could he not do the same? He knew what was right. He knew what was wrong. Moreover, he wasn't afraid to put in a bit of hard work to achieve his goals. That wasn't arrogance on his part. Just the truth. In the end, it was all about hard work. You could achieve just about anything with a little confidence. That was all it took. He had no idea just how much that mindset would change the world. Tenlin says you can't make it back in a minute with my chakra. Blue eyes snapped into scarlet. You're on. 0.0.0.0. Ruby couldn't sleep. Perhaps that was petty of her. But really, she couldn't. After all that arguing with Weiss, then making up with her, and the subsequent coffee-fueled study session that followed, she was just too jazzed up to sleep. She'd tried to. Truly, she had. 5 hours spent tossing and turning, twitching in bed, to no avail. Not a single soul had noticed. They'd slept like babies, utterly ignorant of her plight. So rather than drive her teammates mad or prowl the halls of Beacon like a wraith, she'd opted for a bit of fresh air. Surely the cool night would set her to rights. Well, that had been the plan, but she'd underestimated herself. Or rather, the prodigious amount of caffeine she'd imbibed. In short. Alright, way too much caffeine. A merry little giggle leapt from her lips as she zipped across the courtyard of Beacon, kicked of a wall, and shot into the air. Her cloak waved wildly behind her for all of a moment before she vanished in a cloud of crimson petals and shot over the fountain, grinning from ear to ear like a loon. No one was awake to hear her. Anyone who might have been was too busy to care. Really, it wasn't her fault. She'd had too much caffeine. Pulling herself through another complex maneuver, the Little Reaper hastened her pace and launched herself into the air with such force that the grass singed beneath her feet. She figured the faster she ran, the sooner she would crash. Simple, no. But the boundless energy within her didn't abate in the least. Besides, it would be dawn in a few hours anyway. Might as well enjoy the rush before she crashed. Literally and figuratively. A noise plucked at her ears, giving her pause. Dark boots dug in as she ground to a halt. Ruby's head swiveled left. Then right. Left once more. What was that? There it was again. The faint but indistinguishable sound of rapidly approaching footsteps. It came from the outer yard, toward the cliffs. What was someone doing out and about at this hour? The bullheads didn't ferry anyone around this early. Not even Professor Oobleck woke before sunrise. Wait. Her caffeine-induced haze dulled for a moment. What if it was a bad guy? Nah. She dismissed the thought just as easily. Who in their right mind would try to sneak into Beacon at this hour? Still, she drawled out the word and smacked her lips, maybe a peek wouldn't hurt. Curiosity poked at her. And it kept poking. Poke. 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 Her resolve crumbled like so wet cardboard. In a flash of red she was away. She made it all of 3 steps before she smacked into something. No. Someone. A cloud of red petals collided with a line of golden light, blinding both. Each recoiled. Ruby whirled with a whine, reaching for Crescent Rose, only to realize she'd not brought her weapon with her. It was still secure in her locker. And she'd left her scroll back in the dorm. She was alone in the dark, barely enough light to see, and there was someone out here with her. With her. Frightened silver eyes struggled to adjust as peered in the dark, searching for the culprit. Who's there? A familiar groan answered. Ow. Ruby squinted anew. In a blink, she recognized them. John. She spied a familiar shock of blonde hair. Is that you? Ruby. He whirled with a yelp, kicking up a gust of wind that had left said reaper yelping as it blew her hair back. And if it flattened the grass around her, well. It was too dark to see. Perhaps that was for the best. She missed the flash of guilt that flitted across his face too, and mistook it for panic. Easy, there. Friendly. She kept her hands up, palms splayed to show herself harmless. Friendly. He balked at her. What are you doing out at this hour? Aren't you up a little early? Couldn't sleep. She blinked up at him, suspicion dawning. What about you? He flushed. Would you believe me if I said I was going for a jog? Her head bobbed. Yup. Oddly enough, her reply seemed to surprise him. Just like that. Well, yeah. Nothing wrong with a little training. Maybe, it was a bit weird that he was running about so late, but that was his business, not hers. Although, if you're running, on a whim, she chose to indulge herself. Wanna race? John looked at her like she'd grown a second hard. Where did that come from? Dunno. She swayed on her feet, ignorant of his baffled stare and all that came with it. So, you wanna? A spark of brightly hopeful boyish joy shone through Ark's facade before he managed to mask it. Even then, it made him look surprisingly young. Ruby jolted, somewhat taken aback. John quenched it quickly and looked away to scratch the back of his head. We shouldn't. Come on. She tugged at his arm, dragging it down. It'll be foon. Maybe it was the caffeine high talking, else she'd never be this brave, this bold, this brazen. But John was nice. He knew how to fight, he geeked out over weapons like her, and he'd actually used Crescent Rose. Nobody used Crescent RSE. Nobody but her. And yet when he had, he'd done so gently, almost as if he were afraid of breaking her baby. They could be, oh, what was the word? Weapon buddies. Yes. That was it. We could make a bet Tilda. She sing-songed. John's gaze fastened onto hers with startling clarity. Wow. Pyrrha was right. His eyes really were bright. They almost seemed to glow in the low light. She shivered a little. Was it hot out here all of a sudden? Ahem. She shook her head furiously. Focus. What are we betting on? Oh. She'd really not thought about that last bit. She'd been so certain he'd say no. Silver eyes flitted about the yard, seeking an answer to no avail. They hit upon his sword, still stowed neatly in its sheath. She blurted the first thing that came to mind. I wanna see your sword. A brow quirked. Excuse me. Yeah. In a moment of total desperation she seized on it. The loser has to show the winner their weapon. How's that sound? Is that all? Crocia Morse slid free from her sheath with a wordless whisper. Sure. He held it out for her to inspect. I don't mind showing you mine if you show me yours. Alright, even she wasn't that dense. What was he, a brick wall? Ruby's face flamed and her mind dove down a dark hole from which there was no return. No, no, no. Don't think such things. Do not think. There it was, that sudden surge of emotion in those bright cerulean orbs. Like she'd roused some sort of competitive spirit. Bah. John wasn't like that, right? Anyway, oh gods, he was still talking. She'd spaced out. She coughed once into a fist to hide ehr blush. You wanna run that by me again? I said I'm sure Crescent Rose is way better than Crocea Morse. John repeated placidly. She only has 3 forms. 3. Ruby's mind fizzled and died. No fair. I only have 2. Unbidden her gaze slit to his deceptively simple sword and shield. Pyrrha had mentioned something about it transforming, but the champion never really gone into detail and she'd not pressed the issue. Maybe she should have. Oh wow, 3 forms. What was it? A missile launcher. A laser sword. Laser swords sounded cool. So 3 laps around beacon, then. John tilted his head just so as he stowed his sword. You up to that? Pride tore Aw to shreds. Hey. She stomped a foot and puffed out her cheeks. I'm pretty confident in my speed. If you say so. His hand descended, tousling her hair fondly. Against her better judgment, Ruby found herself leaning into it with a pleased sigh. Huh. He gave pretty nice headpats. What am I doing? She jerked back with a scowl, suddenly grateful for the low light, if only because it hit her flushing face. Hey. What was that for? Sorry. He scratched a whiskered cheek. You just remind me of my sisters, that's all. Ruby's pride shriveled up and died like a grim in the desert. Sis, ters. MMHMM. His head bobbed more than once. Just how many do you have? That's not important. We'll meet back here. He drew a line in the dirt with 1 foot before her temper could get the better of her. Sound good. There was so much she wanted to ask him, but she didn't like the shadowed look on his face. It was the same expression Uncle Kira wore when he got into one of his moods. Some sixth sense prodded her, telling her not to pray any further. Not here. Not now. Not tonight. Instead she granted him brisk nod. Fine by me. Great. He dropped down into a runner's crouch. On your mark. Get set. Ruby set her jaw and mirrored him. Just so you know, I'm gonna kick your. Go. John vanished in a golden flash, kicking up a voluminous cloud of dust. Ruby coughed in his wake. She shot after him in a cloud of crimson. 0.0.0.0. Laughter echoed Bellow Team RWBY's windowsill. A familiar black bow twitched within. What's going on out there? Blake tried to ignore what she'd heard thus far, tried to bury herself in her novel, lose herself in the pages as she always had. In theory it should have been simple. Lose herself in a book like she always did, shut out the rest of the word and let her mind wander in a realm of blissful fantasy. And yet the laughter persisted. Light flashed just outside, sparks of gold warring with intermittent surges of red. Hey! Someone cried. No fair. That's cheating. Ruby. Curiosity got the better of the wayward Belladonna and she sat up, leaning over to investigate. The sight there tore her breath away. A torrent of scarlet petals chased golden lightning around the yard, weaving impossible patterns against grass and stone. It was beautiful. Like watching 2 colors go to war with one another. YYT for all that she could hear laughter. Human laughter. It was faint, any who wasn't a faunus wouldn't notice, much less hear it, but she did, and she was. There. Race lasted all of 15 seconds. The ghost of a frown touched her lips as the yellow flash resolved itself into the shape of a familiar blonde. John. Ruby all but collapsed behind him, sprawled out on the grass. Yet for all her exhaustion he seemed hale and healthy. He hadn't been that fast during initiation. She'd pegged him for a support type, maybe someone with a booster semblance or somesick. Curiouser and curiouser. Paranoia reared its ugly head. Why conceal such abilities? What's she doing down there with him? Blake leaned a bit closer to investigate, straining to hear their words. You know what they say. Curiosity killed the cat. Or caught its eye, in any case. 0.0.0.0. I give up. Ruby fell face first into the muck, wasted and gasping for air. Eyes stinging, lungs burning, chest heaving, it was all she could do to breathe. She hadn't simply run, she'd burned right through her aura, her caffeine, all of it. John raced past her, lapping her again the bastard, adding insult to injury. Once he saw that she'd fallen, he bent to check on her. Does this mean I win? Win. He'd trounced her. What the heck are you? Oddly enough, her words caused him to flinch. I'm nobody. Just a normal guy. Normal. Him. Nah. No way was he normal. Unless. Unbidden her own words came back to her. Normal. Hadn't she told Yang the same thing? I don't wanna be any kind of knees. I just wanna be a normal girl, with normal knees. A faint smile touched her sweat-stricken face. Normal knees. John helped her stand. Pardon. Ruby barely heard him, because her mind was already whirling. She understood now. At least, she thought she did. Maybe. Kinda. Sort of. John was like her. He didn't want to stand out. He just wanted to be a normal person. She'd seen a glimpse of what he could do, but it was only that. A glimpse. He was actively holding back, curtailing what he could do, all to avoid being placed on a pedestal. Why was her heart beating so fast? He knelt before her. Want me to carry you back to your room? Like he'd carried her before. Meep. No. If she left now she'd be tired, sure, but she'd still be tossing and turning for the better part of the night. Don't wanna. There's nothing I can do to help. Silver eyes shone as she clasped her hands together and held them just under her chin. Not even a little. Well, John touched a finger to his chin. I've still got my cooldown exercises, if you really want to help. Ruby pounced on it like a starving Beowulf. Yes, please. Name it. He regarded her with renewed scrutiny. How heavy are you? She blinked. .0.0.0. Yang and Pyrrha found them like that an hour later. You know, the former thumbed her chin. I can't help but feel we missed something here. Ruby made a keening noise through her teeth from where she sat atop John's back. This is not what I had in mind. Yang whistled. How many push-ups does that make now? 100. 2. 3. Pyrrha chimed. She didn't look away from John. Wait a minute, why Ruby's sitting on his back? Something about weight training. Sneaky little sister. She looked like she wanted to bolt too, it was only sheer mortification that rooted her in place. Hey, hotshot. Yang planted a fist on her hip. You. Me. Spar. What'd you say? John grimaced. Maybe later. Don't we have class soon? Boo. Yang sniffed. Don't be such a party pooper. She didn't see Pyrrha's scowl at her back. .0.0.0. Weiss peeked around the corner. And ducked back behind it. She shook her head mightily, ponytail thrashing behind her. No. Nay. Never. Treacherous thoughts. She was a schnee. She would not fall to such base emotions. Weiss looked left. Looked right. Left again. Well, if no one was watching. She snuck another peek. .0.0.0. Achoo. Leagues away, Naruto sneezed. Why do I suddenly feel proud? And so very worried. .0.0.0. John tilted his head. Sue, I gotta ask. Are you and Weiss are good now? Yup. Ruby swallowed once, smacked her lips and looked up from a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs. We're besties again. Besties better than the resties. Weiss bridled but a little, the faintest hint of color hitting her cheeks while she tucked into her own cafeteria fare. I wouldn't go that far. The little reaper turned wide eyes on her. But didn't you say you'd be the best teammate ever? Her face turned scarlet. Ruby. Yang sniggered. Why yes, Blake chimed in, I believe those were words she used. Weiss rounded on her. Not you, too. You were supposed to be Alceep. All of you. John sank back into his seat as the quartet began to squabble anew, this time, their words lacking the bite of days past. By now it seemed more a habit than anything else. Fine by him. Teammates shouldn't fight between themselves. After all, a team was like a family. Family stuck together. Family meant no one got left behind. Oomph. What's wrong? It's just. I'm not used to being away from everyone for this long. Never thought I'd get homesick. He could see them seated at the table in his mind's eye. The image seemed to overlap that of his friends. Mom was probably making a hearty breakfast with saffron while Dad and Balin prepared in a fresh bushel of apples. That would make Sabrina and Sable jealous, of course, to which Jean and Azula would demand attention in turn while he looked on fondly. A hand came down on John's shoulder, jolting him out of his daydream. Relax. She must have mistook his stress for something else, because she clapped him on the back. They're good, Goldilocks. Don't worry about it. John frowned. There it was again, the blasted nickname. I really wish you'd stop calling me that. Fair enough. She leered. How about Whiskers? Prefer that. Better that than Vomit Boy. Kurama chimed in. Hey. Might as well get used to it. Nora shoveled another forkful of pancakes into her mouth, utterly unaware of his inner diatribe. Nicknames are sacred, Johnny. She held up a finger, taking on what he hoped was a faux solemn tone. Once a name finds you, there's no going back. Henceforth, thy nickname shall be Whiskers, O fearless leader. Plaintive blue eyes turned upon Ren and Pyrrha. Please tell me she's joking. Unfortunately, no. The former shrugged. She's incredibly stubborn when it comes to these things. She gave his shoulder a little pat. I'm sorry. Whatever disagreement Weiss and RWBY had must have been solved when he wasn't looking, because come breakfast, the duo were thick as thieves. At least John assumed they were. Weiss wasn't snapping at RWBY, and when the former gave advice, the latter listened. Almost made him envious, that he didn't know the first thing about being a leader. Maybe his teammates had suggestions. Ow. Another voice sliced through his thoughts once more, cutting them to ribbons. That hurts. See. A rough, braying voice chortled. I told you there were real. Neither came from their table. John blinked, wondering why everyone fell silent. Weiss looked chagrined. RWBY and Yang were glaring at something off to the side. Blake joined them. Indeed, she glared golden daggers across the cafeteria. He followed Team RWBY's gaze and soon saw the target of their ire. Poor Velvet. Pyrrha palmed her face. Is Card in at it again? Yeah. Nora's fork bent in her grasp. Ren pursed his lips. Despicable. On that, they were in agreement. Blue eyes widened as he beheld an absolute giant of a student yanking on a girl's long ears. Actual ears. He had a poor rabbit fondness by them, friends laughing, fist yanking hard as they all looked on and mocked her plight. She struggled to escape, to no avail. He heard a whimper thread through her lips. Please stop. A fire ignited deep inside John's chest, burning bright and hot. Kurama noticed his anger at once, if only because he was a part of him. What's got you so hot and bothered, oh? His words trailed off into a deep bass rumble of dismay. John. No. You've already made enough of a scene this week. His uncle made a fair point. But still, why isn't anyone helping her? Much to his chagrin, his friends looked away. Even RWBY dithered. Guys. Weiss stared at her nails. I'm sure she can handle herself. Says the Schnee. Blake sneered. You have no idea what it means to suffer. That has nothing to do with it. They fell back into another argument. John scarcely heard them. A strange buzzing sound hummed in his ears. So you're not going to do anything? None of you. Weiss wilted. It is not our place. She's a second year. I'm sure she can handle herself. He hated that kind of logic, if only because he'd once been the same. Before he'd gathered up the resolve to run away, to make something of himself, he'd been much the same. Always hiding from responsibility, cringing away when faced with any sort of real danger or peril. Even now he was terrified of being in Beacon, afraid of being caught, of his transcripts being revealed for the fakes they were. Afraid of his family dragging him back home. But despite that fear, he persisted. Why couldn't she? Pooh, please. Yang smacked her lips with an audible pop. You're loaded. Just pay him to leave her alone or something. Weiss vowed at her. If you think I'm the sort to simply pay people to do what I want, then you're sadly mistaken. It sounded like she was making excuses. Power should be used for the betterment of others. Her eyes snapped to him. And what do you know about power? Arc. Crap. He'd said that aloud, hadn't he? There could be no taking that back now. To be fair, John Uzumaki Arc hated few things in this world. Most of them started with the letter B, as it were. broccoli, bullshit, and bullies. The latter was right up there at the top of his list. His dislike of them came not from being bullied himself, his sisters had seen to that, but from seeing it firsthand. A village boy had tried bully one of his younger siblings once. The wrath of an arc was a terrible thing. And sometimes the only way to beat a bully is to give them a taste of their own medicine. He stood. Pyrrha saw it. John. I'll be right back. Don't wait up for me. Ren took one look at his expression and frowned. What do you intend to do? He turned a smile on his comrade. It felt brittle on his face. I just want to talk with him. Nora whooped and pumped a fist into the air. That a boy, Johnny. Break his legs. I'll take pictures. I'm just going to talk to him, Nora. The words sounded hollow, even to him. Loudly. Repeatedly. With my fist. His legs were moving almost before he realized what was happening. Someone made a grab for his arm, he never saw who, but he did see Blake to reach across the table and give them a good hard shove. Whoever held him let go with a squawk and he was off. 9 long strides carried him across the mess hall. Now remember, my dear boy. Juniper's voice came back to him suddenly while he walked. We arcs tend to experience emotions a little differently than most. In a moment he was back in the past, sitting cross-legged before her in the glade. We live life vividly. Brilliantly. Sometimes too much so. She touched a finger to his forehead. Take me and your father for instance. When an arc comes to care for someone, they love them with all their heart and soul. When an arc laughs, we do so louder than anyone else. But when an arc hates, well, that's why we're teaching you self-control. Right now, John didn't feel in control. What would Dad do? He tried to imagine it. Beat his ass. Yeah, probably that. Now that he was close enough to hear her cries properly, so too did he see Velvet's face rot with pain. His fingers twitched, curling into claws. Said claws twitched, aching for action. Control. Mustn't let his chakra slip out. Mustn't transform here. He took a deep breath to calm himself and crossed the threshold. Hey! Stop pulling her ears. Caught up in their merriment as they were and with their backs to him, Team CRDL didn't notice John. Velvet did. Wide eyes snapped to his, wet with tears. John felt his left eye begin to twitch. I said. His right hand flicked out, seized Cardin by the wrist, and yanked it down. The boy yelped in surprise. His grip went slack and battered Bunny scrambled back. Hands off the bunny. Deprived of his prey and with clawed fingers biting into his wrist, Cardin took notice of him at last. Up close John realized his foe was rather tall, almost frightfully so. A good head taller than him and all muscle beneath that uniform. Anyone else would have paused, taken a step back to reassess. Size didn't matter. He'd seen bigger. And so he allowed Cardin to tear his arm free. Allowing him to grab him by the shirt. Allowed him to reel him in. Who the hell are you? Just John. He didn't stop smiling. A normal guy. Is that so? Cardin's face filled his field of vision with a sneer. You've ruined my fun, Johnny boy. What are you gonna do about it? Kurama rolled his eyes with a put-upon sigh. Now you've done it. John exhaled in a short, sharp burst of anger. This. His foot slammed down harder than Nora's hammer, leaving the table riven in two to send food flying in every direction. Team CRDL recoiled in surprise. Those tables were reinforced, built to last, manufactured to endure heavy blows from angry students who didn't quite know their own strength. Naturally, John had no way of knowing that. He didn't much care. They were still reeling when John stepped in, seized Cardin by the right ear and yanked. He yanked hard. A howl of pain filled the cafeteria. If anyone hadn't been aware of their scuffle, they were now. What the hell are you doing? Doesn't feel so good, does it? The blonde reared back, hauling the larger boy with him, heedless of Velvet's started stare. This hurts, you know. I've had it done to me before. Painful, isn't it? Cardin bellowed and tried to break his grip, to no avail. Now, this is a lesson your father isn't at all fond of. Juniper smiled at John from the past. But it's an important one all the same. She held up a finger and his eyes followed. You're strong, John, but your body has its limits. When you engage an enemy, not a sibling, not a friend, and certainly not someone you love, it's all about perception. You must have fear, surprise, and intimidation on your side. For if any one of these things is lacking, it would best to retreat. Break your foes before you face them, my son. In a world like this, it's the only way to survive. Yeah, Mom was a little scary when it came to life lessons. But they served him well now. Dove lunged at him from the corner of his eye. He reached back, caught him by the face, and swung him into Russell as one might a large stick. Sky sputtered as his teammates crashed atop him, all but pinning him to the floor. They were still struggling to rise when John kicked back and flattened with half the table. A chorus of groans greeted him. They didn't get up after that. Cardin snarled in his grasp and threw a wild haymaker. Why, you? John took it to the face without so much as a blink. He didn't fight like a huntsman. He fought like a shinobi. Satisfying as it might be. He didn't need to beat Cardin and his team here. He just needed to terrify them. Acting it was, then. He was a good actor, mostly. Who made you God, little man? With a snarl he reared back, slamming Cardin face first into what remained of the once proud table. Not that mace, not that uniform, nothing. He swung him down again, stunning the bigger boy. You wanna scare people? Fine. I could use a scarecrow. His forehead slammed against Cardin's, teeth gone sharp and eyes blazing red. You're gonna be my personal message board. He folded Cardin Winchester like a pretzel. A ways behind him, Velvet tilted her head at the sight. Young whistled. Ouch. He's gonna feel that in the morning. Pyrrha's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a small giggle. Oh, my. 0.0.0.0. Mercifully, combat class came next. It was here that Miss Goodwitch lived up to her reputation. She was certainly glaring at John as if she expected him to fly off the handle at any given moment. She suspected of course, but she couldn't prove anything. No one had stepped forward to testify against him, and Team CRDL was decidedly unconscious. In theory it was just a food fight gone awry. A remarkably one-sided food fight, that had only affected Team CRDL and no one else. Just a bit of targeted aggression that had left 4 unruly boys in the school infirmary. It happened, of course. Boys would be boys and no matter the punishment it was well worth. Okraps he looked like Shuanted to snap him in half. Is there a problem, Mr. Ark? Crap. She'd caught him staring. He pointedly looked away from her and whistled innocently. I say again, you're an awful liar. You've got guilt written all over your face. Nonsense. He could do this. Shouldn't be hard. John Ark will face. HMM. Green eyes sought them out. Miss Schnee, you seem eager today. Why don't you try your luck? John hope, pride, and confidence died an awful choking death. He wheezed. Why? The girl absolutely glowered at him. Well, this boded poorly. Pyrrha squeezed his shoulder. Fight well, partner. It's not the fighting I'm worried about. His gaze found the small Schnee with a wince. She was already glaring icy daggers at him. Indeed, he could have sworn he heard her snarl at him when he ascended the steps. Was she still mad at him? Girls were weird. He just didn't understand them sometimes. He hadn't done anything to upset her. Had he? You really think you're something special, don't you? She grit her teeth. First that scene in Initiation, and now the cafeteria. How long do you intend to mock me? What? His cringe wasn't at all feigned. Me? Special? I'm not special at all. And I wasn't mocking you. Lies. Weiss lifted Mertenaster. John brandished Crocia Morse. Miss Goodwitch stepped back sharply. Begin. With a flick of his wrist, Crocia Morse transformed, her hilt lengthening as the metal blade fell away. In its place a blazing line of blue plasma burst free with an electric snap hiss. He brandished the saber of light, sending it humming by the air. Ruby squealed from the sidelines. Your sword really does transform. John curtained a smile. Really, the second form was good enough for something like this. No need to bust out the third here. Carefully, he modulated his chakra and set his saber to low power. Wouldn't do to cut anyone in half, after all. That definitely wasn't normal. And while he might not like Weiss at the moment, he liked Ruby. Weiss wasn't a friend, but she wasn't an enemy either. It availed him not. She arched an eyebrow. How did your sword turn into that? Ruby nearly flung herself into the arena. I want that. No, John planted his feet with a sigh. You don't. Weiss closed on him in a whirl of steel. She had impeccable form, coming from an arc, that was saying something. Weiss Schnee didn't so much duel as she did dance, her poise perched on perfection. Myrtanaster weaved a cold cage of steel round him, forcing him to defend in kind. John ducked back as a low swipe raked his chin, drawing a thin line of blood across his cheek. He parried, then gave ground, and Weiss chased him with a hiss. A dull click of her rapier was his only warning before she swiped at him anew. Stop running. She snarled. Fight me like you mean it, you oaf. I will not be made a fool of. He let her rapier trip him up and send him sprawling. Her words stung more than the fall. Maybe he should try after all. Just a pinch. Just a little. She wanted him to. Blue eyes flashed as he climbed upright. All right. You asked for it. Weiss barely had time to raise Myrtanaster in her defense. Then she found herself fighting a storm of blue light. Naruto was no stranger to lust. You see, lust came in many forms. He'd seen them all in his world and this one. Lust for knowledge. Lust for power. Lust for recognition from one's peers. Even lusting for love. Lust was a little bit like greed in that regard, just about everyone knows it. Well, he knew more love than lust at this point, but the saying still stuck. Naruto Uzumaki loved Juniper Arc, just as she loved him. They were madly in love. And also lust. Perhaps it's something that happens when two blondes get together. Maybe wires cross somewhere. Or stars align in the heavens. That sort of thing. Who can say? Regardless, the two of them were utterly, madly without restraint when it came to their life together, to say nothing of more, intimate matters. How else do you think they could have so many children? With no signs of stopping at that. So, yes, he understood what it was to feel strongly for someone, and how powerful those feelings might be. But at the end of the day, whatever one might say, Juniper was more than enough for him. His gaze did not wander, his eyes did not rove, because he felt no need to. One was better than two in his mind, any more than that and he'd surely go mad. Likewise, he'd tried to steer his off-PSRING in the same direction wouldn't to overrun Remnant, and for the most part, he felt he'd succeeded. For the most part. The ghost of a smile touched his lips as he scribbled another line in his journal. Went through Pietro's ledger again today, he murmured to himself, words rising over the faint skirch of his pen. Narrowed a few names down. His mouth pursed in a frown as a thought occurred to him, a suspicion that was swiftly jotted down. Schnees might be involved in the attack. A query followed the statement. Ironwood innocent. He drew a line under it before writing below. Still looking for John. Not in Vacuo or Atlas. Might need to keep an eye on the kids. Especially. A faint banging from upstairs distracted him. And then, look out below, Pops. Kurama scoffed in his head. Speak of the devil. Naruto's right arm snapped up without so much as a backward glance, lazily catching the object before it could strike the back of his skull. He whipped it around to hold it before his face, considering it with a keen eye. Strange little device. Almost looked like a mechanical monkey of some sort. He didn't turn at first, if only because doing so would have revealed his smile. Instead he set the device pen down and laid his free hand on the table. Blue eyes alighted upon the window and beheld a bright shock of dyed azure hair in its reflection just behind him. He tutted softly and shook his head twice. Making explosives again, are we, powder? A soft gasp reached his ears, telling him he was right on the mark. No. Firm fingers glided over the mechanism and peeled it apart. What have I told you about these? The cheeky slip of a girl stared at her toes. To do it outside. Naruto quirked a brow. And heard a little shoe scuff against the floor. To only use them on Grim. That's my girl. With a flick of his fingers the would-be incendiary device sailed up into the air to tumble end over end. For a moment it hung aloft, before gravity had its say. He let it land then spin merrily on one finger before batting back into his palm. She really did have a talent. Still, this was mostly harmless as it was now. An explosion was hardly going to hurt anyone in the Arc family. They were made of sterner stuff than most. A lazy underhand throw sent the toy hurtling her way. He heard his daughter scuttle forward to catch it and finally pivoted in the chair to face her fully. Her pale, hopeful face stared up at him, cheeks pinching in a frown. She wasn't his blood, not like the others, but he didn't regret that fateful day, nor taking her in, even for a second. They'd found her dying in a ditch and nursed her back to health. The Ark family was his, after all. If he wanted to adopt the odd urchin here and there he certainly could. Juniper certainly didn't mind. Finally, she found her voice. So, you're not mad. Why would I be? He patted her head. You have a gift. Use it. The tiniest smile bloomed. Her eyes flitted to the table and his messy notebook. Whatcha writing? Nothing you need worry about. Naruto kissed her forehead, then laughed when she squared away. Go play with your sisters. And remember. He pulled back and flicked her toy with a wink. It's our little secret. Besides, he leaned against his chair, if you want to see a really big explosion, just ask me. She perked up. Really? Sure. Ask me in a few days and I'll set something up. MK. She darted forward, gave him a quick hug, burying her head in his chest. Naruto waved her off with a smile. Go on, now. Don't let your mother catch you with that. And scurried outside with a giggle. Thanks, Papa. Kurama scoffed. Softy. The wayward warrior shrugged and returned to his notes as the pleasant sounds of laughter echoed forth from the yard. Life was good. Now if he could just track down his equally wayward son. John's call had been a mite bit grainy the other day, but he'd seen enough to draw his own conclusions. A quick check of the student rosters merely confirmed it. Unlike Mistral and Vale, Shade and Atlas were known to display the names of their would-be huntsmen most proudly. If Atlas had John, they would have negotiated from a position of strength, rather than send a squad after his family. Moreover, his son had always hated hot climates. He wouldn't last a day in the desert on his own. Which left Mistral and Vale, each problems in their own right. Naruto was fairly certain she had Haven wrapped around her little finger, while he held Beacon firmly in hand. One academy was practically right next door, not even a day's run for him. The other was clear across the world. He could send a clone to one and investigate the other. He shrugged and kept writing, muttering out his notes as he did. Talk to Pyrrha. A pause, followed by a quick note near the bottom. Seems nice. Saffron's girlfriend had been an unexpected surprise all things considered, but at the end of the day it was her life to live. So long as she was happy, so too was he. After all, he'd looked into her. Much to his chagrin, Pyrrha wasn't an Atlas spy, a foreign plan, or even some ne'er-do-well hoping to strike it rich on the secret of chakra. She was, all things considered, a perfectly normal girl with her aura unlocked. Even her semblance wasn't particularly noteworthy. She could harden her skin to deflect damage. Her record was utterly ordinary. Nothing squeaky clean mind you which would have drawn suspicion of a different sort. Just a few misdemeanors here and there, an arrest for protesting against Faunus abuse, nothing more. If she was to be believed, Saffron had been the one to bumbled into her. Believable. He jotted another note down. Seems like something she'd do. Something you do, more like. True. Saffron did take after him. His little super girl, always charging headfirst into danger, leaping first and asking questions later. Thankfully, none of her siblings had shown any romantic inclinations just yet. Valen had no interest in anything other than her training, likely because anyone she met failed to meet the Herculean standards she'd set. She wanted someone strong, but also one who would also pamper her, someone able to best her in battle, yet in the same vein no so proud as to deny defeat. Sabrina and Sable were likewise extremely choosy, all but refusing to interact with anyone outside of the family. Jean was too young to understand such things, and likewise, Azula was more likely to burn a boy's look at them. To say nothing of Powder. She was more interested in her toys than anything else. She'd make a fine arc once he trained her up. Maybe a bit of chakra would help. Penny was, well, Penny. His granddaughter would be fine. After all, she too was an exception. When he'd first met Pietro all those years ago, he'd been little more than a man with a dream, a scientist down on his luck. He'd taken him and given him a bit of instruction, a nudge in the right direction, followed by a few drops of his own precious blood and chakra. All with no expectations of a reward or any real result. And now, surprise surprise, years later, he had a grandchild. Naruto cocked a weather eye at the thought of her, no, at his granddaughter. By the log it felt weird to say that. He and Juniper had often contemplated the idea of grandchildren in the future, just not quite this soon. But she'd been made from his chakra and Pietro's aura. Palendina, who had been like a son to him in all but name. Penny was his daughter. Thus, his granddaughter. What else could she possibly be? She'd slotted right into their little family. Even now he could hear her laughter just outside. Silly girl. She was probably tormenting Valen again. And then they came to the black sheep of the family. Kurama grimaced. You mean John? I do. Naruto sighed and tapped a finger against the table. Ah, but John. He was so proud of him, and yet so very, very worried. He needed to find which academy he'd gone to. He's got 2 girls on his team. The timeless warrior muttered to himself as he scribbled down another note in his journal. What am I going to do with that boy? The pen snapped in his hand, spattering the page with ink so dark it almost looked like blood. I don't even know where he is. A new notion struck him even as he snatched up another. Wait. He flicked a thought inward. Kurama, you've kept in contact with him, right? A noise of consent confirmed his suspicions. Great. Then you can save me some time. Where'd he run off to? The kitsune clammed right up. Indeed, his silence proved telling. Naruto sighed into it. You're not going to tell me, are you? He's doing well. That's all I'll say. Cheeky little furball. Kurama. Sorry. He didn't sound apologetic. Not one bit. This is for the best. Your brat needs a chance to spread his wings and learn. I'll be there to keep an eye on him. Speaking of which. A hand laid itself on his and broke the link. Daydreaming again, dear. I'll leave you to it. Have fun, Tilda. Oi. I'm not done with you. Silence reigned. Naruto craned his neck up to find green eyes close to his, framed by a blonde hair and a coy smile. His lips parted to speak and Juniper silenced them with her own. His brain blanked for a moment as he inhaled reflexively, the brief lapse of which gave her the chance to slid into his lap. The chair creaked beneath their combined weight. He barely noticed, because her hands were threading through his hair, breasts crushing against his chest, hips grinding against his through the fabric of their clothes. He realized what she was getting at a moment later and drew back. You're trying to distract me. He frowned a little. Aren't you? That depends. His wife chased him with her lips, breath hitching softly between linger kisses. Is it working? The girls are right outside. He muttered as her hands began to play with the buttons of his shirt. For the most part. She cooed between kisses. They're carving. A blonde brow rose. Carving what, exactly? She winked. You'll see for yourself. For a fleeting moment he considered resisting. Then he looked at her again. Even after all these years, Juniper Arc was just as lovely as he remembered, no, even more so. Perhaps it had something to do with all the time they'd spent together, laid together. All their children. Maybe fate was finally smiling on him. Truth be told, Naruto didn't know, or care. His arm tightened around her waist, drawing her close. You're about to see a whole lot more. Her smile was all teeth. As I recall, I was on top last time. She knew just what to say to rile him up. That's about to change. The door clattered open behind them before Juniper could hope to respond. Grandfather. A familiar voice called. Grandmother. Look what I made. Naruto slumped with a sigh. Juniper didn't budge from his lap, though she did roll her hips against him one last time to ease him further. He bit back a groan. Sneaky succubus, leaving him and dry like that. Still, there was nothing he could do. He daren't move, if only because he couldn't trust his legs to carry him at the moment. Penny knew none of this. She darted forward and held up her creation for him to inspect. Look, grandfather. Did I make it properly? She held up the fruits of her labor, a fine wooden carving in the shape of a nine-tailed fox. Naruto reached over and traced his thumb over it, admiring the craftsmanship. He looked away, face gone red. Too adorable. Must protect. My sweet precious girl. Juniper was less subtle. She all but dove on her. Naruto watched with a smile. Maybe he could give John a few more days. So long as his son held back, there was nothing to worry about. 0.0.0.0. He wasn't holding back. Weiss knew it at the first brush of their blades, felt the telltale flicker of dread when she and John crossed weapons for a second, then third time, followed by a fourth and a fifth. Each exchange left her arms screaming, shoulders aching as shockwaves slammed down her arms. Not even 5 minutes of this and already her fingers had gone nearly numb against Myrtanaster's grip. Merely blocking was a physical effort in and of itself, one that took more and more from her with each pass. Really, she had no one to blame but herself. In hindsight she really should have known better than to engage Ark in a contest of brute strength, but she was just so terribly cross with him at the moment. Instead, like some rank amateur, she'd let that fury cloud her judgment. Anger had her standing her ground, when she really shouldn't have. Anger nearly got overpowered her almost immediately. A broad sweep of his blazing blue saber sent her stumbling away. What's wrong? He gave his blade a flourish, sending it thrumming through the air. I thought you wanted to fight. Weiss bridled. Why you? Sparks flew as Ark's plasma weapon slammed into Myrtanaster. A tiny gasp tore past her lips. Even at low power his weapon threatened to shear clear through hers. Had it a voice, her rapier would have shrieked in pain. Weiss nearly did when that blade swept across her hand. Hot. It burned. She recoiled, pivoted, to no avail. Taking his blade in both hands, John planted his feet, grit his teeth, and pushed her blade back. Weiss leaned with it, knees buckling under the onslaught. There were no jokes or jabs now. Only cold, searing intent. Azure orbs met startled ice blue. One of her legs buckled and her balance faltered. She heard her team gasp behind her, even as JNPR cheered their leader on. All the while she was forced down, down, down. I'm sorry. John sounded almost contrite as she fell to a knee. This is the part where you lose. He wasn't even being cruel about it. That made it so much worse. Did he think her weak? She hadn't even begun to fight. Frantic, she slammed an elbow up at his groin, only to find herself blocked by one of his greaves. A faint hiss pushed past her lips when he redoubled his efforts and pushed her back yet further. Think, Weiss, think. She flailed for a solution as her muscles quivered. What do you have that he doesn't? The gods were good, for the answer came to her almost immediately. Range. For all his speed and strength, Ark had already revealed his hand, showing himself to be a close combat fighter. Time and time again he sought to close the distance between them and strike. She'd played his game out of anger, but now, with the odds against, she realized that was a mistake. She did not have to fight like a berserker, nor was she bound by such conventional limitations. Time to fight like a Schnee. In a rare lapse of decorum, Weiss took one hand from her rapier's hilt and flicked two trembling fingers at his serene visage. Myrtanaster clicked furiously as she brought a fresh dust cylinder to bear. A solid white glyph smashed John right in the nose, hard light dust burning through the air to strike him head-on. On the screen above, his aura barely budged. The same could not be said for his body. He staggered back on reflex, startled by the brash maneuver. Weiss let him take 3 steps, weapon raised before her face, and whirled. Yah! With a triumphant cry she flicked her rapier's cylinders. Fire dust clicked in. Her fingers moved anew, trailing red light as they kissed cold steel. The moment she reached the rapier's peak she stepped forth and flung a wave of fire dust in his face. It struck Ark head-on and exploded, leaving him coughing harshly. He waved a plume of smoke away from his visage. Now, she took the chance to surge forward and strike at his knees. She'd knock him off his feet and end this in a single blow. That would show him. A low growl pierced the haze. Blue burned gold in the smoke. It was her only warning. Weiss dropped a glyph and kicked off it with all her might. Even then she wasn't fast enough. Blazing light filled her vision and she twisted, her spine all but parallel with the ground as that blazing bar of blue light whistled over her head. A few stray strands of white hair fluttered to the ground, leaving her to swear at the near miss. Then he was on again, forcing her back once more, driving her through a dizzying array of glyphs and kick just to evade too close. John wasn't trying to kill her and frankly he couldn't with her aura up but it would have hurt all the same. She realized her mistake a moment later. Admirable as her acrobatics were, her last leap had carried her just a touch too far, leaving her wide open. John was many things, but he wasn't a fool when it came to combat. He leapt up to meet her, caught her by the right ankle. She had half an instant to balk. That was no mere leap. You can fly. John beamed. Nope. Jump good. Then he yanked. Pain flared in her leg, pain that was eclipsed as he whipped her into the mat face first like some raggedy doll. Weiss scarcely had time to yelp before she struck the ground, a yelp that turned into a scream of pain as stars flashed before her vision. Distantly, she heard Ruby's cry. Weiss. Not now, you. She tried to speak only for her body to betray her. All she managed was a raspy gasp as she curled in on herself. Oh gods, the pain. It felt like he'd cracked one of her rib. Her fingers touched her nose and came away red. But how? Her aura was still up. She could feel it. You couldn't just cut through it. That a boy, Johnny. Nora hollered encouragement over her muted whimper. Show that silly Schnee who's boss. In the corner of her eye, Goodwitch began to raise her weapon. Miss Schnee. Are you unable to continue? Pride sparked back to life in her chest and she slapped a closed fist against the mat. I can still fight. She wouldn't be defeated like this. No. Nay. Never. To surrender now after such a horrid showing, she'd never live it down. Laughter echoed in her ears, imagined or otherwise. John hesitated in her peripherals, golden eyes shimmering back to blue. Maybe you should stop. Anger knotted in her stomach. Shut your mouth. This isn't over. Miss Goodwitch sighed. Then stand, Miss Schnee. Wasted and gasping for air, Weiss nevertheless found the strength to claw her way won her knee. Her body fought her every step of the way. Muscles creaked. Bones ached. She raised her head and stole a glance at the scoreboard above, balked at what she found there. It couldn't be. Look again, her mind cried. We are, answered her eyes. It's real. Much to her chagrin, her aura was well into the yellow, while arcs remained a healthy green. Shame stung her like a swarm of angry rapier wasps. She had worked for this. Earned her place in Beacon. And yet this cheery fool was making a fool of her. It was, by any and all accounts, a clear accounting of their skills. Her fingers bit into the mat as she growled. The world held its breath. As you wish. At length their instructor complied, though the look Weiss received proved absolutely scathing. However, this match will end once either of auras reached the red. Am I clear? Weiss nodded. Crystal, ma'am. Miss Goodwitch stepped back. You may continue. John flicked a reluctant look at her. Do we have to? Look, I'll forfeit. There's no need to. All the world went red. A line of white glyphs sent Weiss surging forward at unnatural speed. Myrtanaster rammed forward. She crashed into him at speed, driving him back half a pace. Her sole reward was a grunt. Continue. Ark finished with a sigh, lowering his shield. I'm sorry, did I say something to offend you? Offend me? Her forehead smashed against his. Your existence offends me. His right foot shifted just so, more than enough to spook her. Kicking off his shield, she pirouetted away, caromed off another glyph, and landed at the edge of the ring. Myrtanaster trailed a wave of hoarfrost in the air as only she could. A flick of the wrist sent a wave of jagged icicles hurtling his way. That a girl, Weiss. Ruby hollered her support for the brief stalemate. Represent Team RWBY. John turned a puzzled expression on her. I thought you were cheering for me. Her teammate quailed, looked left, now right. Go both of you. You heard her. Yang thumped a fist down. Fight. Pyrrha hollered her support. Be brave, John. Weiss bridled as the boy actually turned his back on her to frown at the stands. I don't think bravery's the problem here. She slammed into him with a shriek, abandoning finesse entirely. Myrtanaster met the blazing blade of Crocea Morse time and time again in a wild waltz of light and steel. More than once, he crashed through her guard as if it weren't even there. A vicious kick caught her ribs and hurtled her to the ground. Her aura plummeted that much more. John didn't give her a chance to feel the pain, much less rise to catch her breath. An overhead swing hammered down as she rolled aside, and a line of fire burst forth, nearly catching her ponytail as she tumbled aside. It was too much. He pursued relentlessly, using nothing more than sheer bloody strength and speed to overwhelm her, forcing her to disengage yet further, skipping backward like a frightened child. He closed the distance all too quickly. A stray blow caught her tiara and tore it in half, freeing her hair from its ponytail. It blew down into her face at once, eliciting a snarl. Huh. John hesitated. Crocia Morse touched the floor, eliciting a sizzling hiss. You look kinda nice with your hair down. In the background, Yang gave a low whistle. Smooth move there, Whiskers. Weiss felt her face flame a bright embarrassed pink. How dare Ak? He surged forward, and something in her recoiled despite her best efforts to stay strong. Distance. She must put some distance between them. There was a way to beat him, there has to be. A mistake, some weakness he had, an accident she could exploit. Something. Anything. Wow, those really were bright eyes. She threw herself to one side as his blade swept in at her ribs. It raked her thigh instead. Pain blossomed there, but still she fought on in spite of it, whirling to meet him anew. Her aura plummeted anew as they traded blows. Ark fought well. Too well. His blade blurred in at vicious angles, and his agility left him near impossible to track. For every blow she landed he dealt two more. All her training, all her skill, all her everything meant nothing before a foe like this. Weiss knew herself well, knew her skills better than anyone else. She also knew her limits. She was beginning to fear the outcome, that she wouldn't be able to win. It gnawed at her. Never had the gap between her and another become more apparent than it was now. No, not a gap. This was a chasm. It didn't make any sense. A frustrated scream tore out of her as Myrtanaster glanced off his shield, less so when said shield bashed her in the face. She stumbled away, clutching at her nose. She was a Schnee. She'd given her body and soul to her training. She had sacrificed and bled, and sacrificed to get where she was now. So why was she losing to some country bumpkin? How? The word tore out of her as she flicked a fresh wave of ice at him. How are you this strong? I'm really not. John evaded and allowed himself a smile, utterly at his ease, seemingly the first real smile he'd felt in quite some time. But if you want an answer. He thumbed his chin, considered her words for a moment, and finally shrugged. Push-ups, sit-ups, and plenty of juice. Weiss felt her right eye begin to twitch anew. Juice. Blake leaned forward just so. Here it comes. Everyone facepalmed. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. She thrust forward in a blind rage, aiming for his center mass. Two fingers flicked out and pinched, catching her rapier's thin point before it could pierce one of his joints. His fist closed around it fully, entrapping the metal against firm fingers. You really should stop. His words were her father's all over again. I don't want to hurt you. Hurt her. He'd wounded her pride well past repair, dealt her courage a fatal blow, maimed her dignity beyond recognition. I was meant for this. Tears pricked at her eyes as she snarled up at him. His words further stoked the fury in her soul as she struggled to extricate her weapon anew. I trained for this. Threw myself into it. Mastered my senses. Where did you train, Ark? On a farm. The blonde boy blinked. Yes. Pyrrha stifled a smile against her palm. Weiss drove her knee into his shin. When he moved to defend, she tore her rapier free and stabbed down, rendering the ring a glossy sheet beneath their feet. It was a good move, a timeless classic that hadn't failed her before. He should have slipped and fallen. But he didn't. He laughed and all but skated across, somehow moving faster despite the unstable terrain. Why were his feet glowing? Weiss backpedaled. Too little, too late. No. Stay back. Stay. Clenched knuckles slammed into her stomach and blasted the breath from her lungs, physically lifting her feet from the floor. Weiss felt her aura plummet. Spittle sprayed from her lips. Her body folded with a whimper as her knees hit the mat soon thereafter. Myrtanaster fell from her fingers and clattered to the mat. Time slowed to a crawl. Someone cried out. She wasn't sure who. Weak. A nasty little voice whispered in the back of her head. No. Useless. Just like father said. No, no. Nothing like your sister. No, no, no. I'm sorry. Ark's hilt came crashing down to deliver the knockout blow. Something snapped deep inside Weiss. No, perhaps that wasn't it. She felt a pierce of herself click into place. And quite suddenly, she understood. Ark. An icy glyph burst beneath her, the sheer force of which drove her foe back 3 steps. And just like that, something came through. A giant armored arm forged of white hoarfrost tore its way into existence, breaching the surface of the glyph with an awful hiss. As she looked on in awe, it planted itself upon the mat for balance and levered itself upright. With its passing came another arm, followed by a pair of broad shoulders, a neck, a head, then finally the main torso itself. John stepped back. This is new. In no time at all it loomed large over them both, casting both combatants in its stellar shadow. Only then could she truly take it in. Her new ally wore a medieval suit of armor, easily twice as tall as she, its visor dark as the blackest shadow. Glistening with white on blue frost, it called forth a sword and brought it to bear in her defense, warding her foe away. Weiss felt her lips part, forming a small, round oval of surprise. As she looked on, the knight planted its blade in the ground, knelt before her, actually knelt, and offered her a giant hand. She flinched, recalling an unpleasant memory, if only for a moment. Fortunately her fingers were quick to betray her. They curled around a giant digit and allowed it to help her stand. You. The knight bowed its head yet further. Weiss recognized it at once, how could she not? It was the very foe that blasted Arma Gigas, she'd defeated not long ago back in the manor, the same implacable enemy she'd bested at her father's behest, and in doing so, won the right to attend Beacon. But why was it here? Unless. Realization dawned. Her semblance. She'd finally made a breakthrough. John looked up with a wry express of awe. Wow. That's certainly something. It is. Ahem. I mean, it is, isn't it? She pivoted to face him on trembling legs, grimaced for a moment at her faltering aura reserves, then rallied. I'd understand if you want to surrender. Behind her, the Arma Gigas rose to its full towering height. Please surrender. A little voice whimpered in the back of her head. Everything's spinning. Her eyes flicked back up to the scoreboard. After the beating she'd taken, that little breakthrough, Zhu Ti now had left her aura nearly in the red. Even now she could feel it plummeting. If she didn't finish this soon she'd be the loser by default, semblance or no. But maybe she didn't have to win. He was clearly impressed by the sight of her summons, and his back was to said board. If she could just press the advantage, intimidate him to give up the bout. Just give up before I keel over. Nah. His smile shattered any hope she might have had. I think I've changed my mind. There was something different about his smile now, a wild edge that hadn't been there before. I didn't know you were hiding an ace like this. He tilted his head just so. You're pretty amazing after all. Weiss bridled. Again with the compliments. Was he really? No. There wasn't any time. She needed to act now, before she passed out. She flicked a thought at her summons and prayed it wasn't a fluke. The knight moved accordingly, readying itself and leaping forward, all but devouring the distance in a single bound. Its speed startled even her, had it always been so agile. Whatever the case, it closed the gap well before John Arc could rush in again. Behind it, Weiss dove on Myrtanaster, retrieved her trusty weapon, and clambered to her feet. As such, she raised her gaze just in time to see her knight strike. Its blade slammed down in a single overhand sweep. John's right arm rose to intercept. Frost sprayed upward. Weiss flung up an arm against it, squinting in the haze that followed, a mist that blinded both combatants and spectators alike. It cleared almost immediately, but the damage had been done. She saw. He'd tanked it on his shield. His aura definitely took a hit and the metal had suffered for it, warping and cracking before the sheer cold of the knight's blade. She supposed she should be grateful for that. If he'd caught it barehanded she would have lost her mind, never mind that. He shouldn't be standing at all. A threadbare whisper pushed past her lips as he continued to stand tall. What are you? His smile was pure as the glistening snow. Just a normal student. Like you. Normal, she muttered. And I'm the queen of Remnant. Really? He blinked a bit at that. You cannot be serious. Beast. A bell rang. Weiss looked up, terribly startled, but already knowing what she'd find there. Her aura had finally reached the red. No, beyond that. It was virtually gone. But his. She'd finally brought him into the yellow. The faintest smile creased her pale face. With it went the last of her strength. She slumped to her knees, hair covering her face. Legs sprawled out beneath her. Her knight planted its blade and fizzled out behind her. In place of anger, she felt only exhaustion. No. Perhaps that wasn't quite true. Something strange and unfamiliar itched at her chest. It felt like respect. She pitched forwards. Whoa, there. Her head landed in Ark's arms as he caught her. Embarrassment blazed through her anew. She pawed at him weakly for a moment and succeeded only in entangling herself with him further. Her good arm slapped at his chest to no avail. Had she the strength, she would have stuck him in the leg for holding her as such. As it was, she managed little more than uncoordinated flailing. Enough. Hazy blue eyes flickered up to meet his. I yield. Miss Goodwitch reacted instantly. John Ark wins by merit of forfeit. Really? John regarded her with a sigh as the buzz of conversation rose around them. I wanted to go a little longer. A strange noise bloomed in the air. It took Weiss a long moment to realize it was laughter. Her laughter. When was the last time she'd laughed? She couldn't recall. Perhaps it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was all that aura she'd lost. She didn't know. Didn't care. Everything felt so heavy. She couldn't keep her eyes open. Her head felt fuzzy. Did she have a concussion? Still, Ark really did have nice arms. Firm and strong, all corded muscle. He held her gently, despite having no reason to do so. She rather liked that. Definitely a concussion. Either way, she wasn't satisfied. Not completely. This isn't over, Ark. John scratched his cheek with a lone finger. I think it is, though. It, most certainly is not. She tried to stifle a yawn, to no avail. Mark my words. I will have my revenge. She'd tan his hide next time. Once her aura recovered, once she mastered her awakened semblance, she'd show him. Normal. Her pale face flushed anew. You really aren't normal at all, Ark. Jaun. RWBY slammed into his back before he could respond. Gimme your sword. He recoiled and the moment was lost. For now. RWBY, what? Wait just a second. Hey. Don't grab me. RWBY, yes. The little weapon addict giggled, all but reaching Overee's shoulders. Show me more. Show me Tilda. Yang shrugged. You brought this on yourself. She's never gonna stop now until you give up the goods now. RWBY made a keening noise and rounded on her. Yang. Don't say it like that. It was all too much. Weiss closed her eyes and surrendered to her body. Sleep now, deal with this madness later. Much later. Normal, Ark had said. She'd see about that. 0.0.0.0. Quite the show, wouldn't you say? Glinda hummed noncommittally as she and Port watched two teams hoist the exhausted Schnee between them. It certainly was. Her lips pursed as she considered John Ark anew. Semblances aside, there's something about that boy, something familiar, almost as if ease. Nonsense, my dear. Peter clapped her on the back, distracting her at the last. You must be imaging things. Was she? She didn't think she was. Ark's fighting style ranged from eclectic to outright explosive. Could that be his semblance? He'd moved with frightful speed, tanked hits he had no business enduring, and recovered far, far too quickly. To say nothing of his skill with the blade. She'd seen that sword style somewhere before. But where? A faint pressure blossomed in the back of her head, bringing forth a mild migraine as she dwelt upon it further. She winced. Where had she seen that form? A young woman appeared in her mind's eye, dancing with a blade. She had green eyes and flowing blonde hair. She smiled at her. You're getting sloppy, Glinda. The memory slipped through her grasp when she reached for it, so much oil in water. Bah! She shook off the sudden malaise that followed. If it really was that important, she'd remember, sooner or later. Yes, she relented after a moment. I suppose you're right. She touched a hand to her brow. It's been a long day, and I'm tired. Good afternoon, Peter. Port wavered after her. Give James my regards. Peter waited until she rounded the corner. Only then did he smile. Nothing personal, dear girl. He muttered to himself once she was gone. I'm afraid I can't let you spill the beans just yet. A spark of something flashed through his oft-closed eyes as he opened them, mustache lifting above his smile. After all, you'd spoil all my fun and then I wouldn't get to see him dance. Peter Port whistled a merry little tune as he waltzed off. It promised to be an interesting year. What fun, what fun. He'd finally narrowed it down. Naruto considered the dossiers sprawled across on the desk before him with a smile that would have put Salem herself to shame. Face limned by flickering candlelight, he reached out and shuffled two aside, leaving three upon the worn wooden frame. Perhaps that was old-fashioned of him, using something like a candle in the dead of night when he could simply turn on the light. But he wouldn't. Wouldn't do to wake Juniper, after all. She needed her rest. Still, her slumber didn't stop in form humming in satisfaction. Gotcha now, ya bastard. No reply, which meant the bulk of Kurama's attention was focused elsewhere for the moment. Likely on John. Say what you would about the old fox, but he was a good uncle. How he managed to split his focus between so many children he'd never know, but it was nothing short of a godsend for him. Cheeky fox. He stifled a yawn behind his palm. Off having the time of his life with John, and here I am doing all the work. Weary blue eyes flitted back to the papers. Just a little more, then he could sleep. 3 lists. 3 pictures. 3 names. 3 individuals narrowed down out of dozens by him, Pietro, each of whom might be responsible for striking at his home using Atlas resources. No one else possessed the authority, the means, or the method to manipulate the Atlesian Council. Ironwood had been a suspect for a time, but sheer ineptitude ruled him out at last. What manner of general would throw away a winning hand like that? No, like it or not, he was innocent in this. He burned his photo over the candle and let wind carry the ashes out the window. Next came Jacques Schnee. He'd only ever met the man once during a brief trip to Atlas. It hadn't been a pleasant encounter. For Jacques. That had been, 15 years ago. He'd left him with a bruised ego and a black eye besides. The less said about that the better. He seemed the sort to hold a grudge, but in the same vein, he didn't think Jacques knew where he lived. Still he had pull in Atlas. Enough to command the ace ops. Unlikely. But he might be able to put pressure on someone who could. He kept his dossier and slid it aside, just in case. Which left his final suspect. Arthur Watts. He hadn't been familiar with the name until Pietro revealed it to him. A disgraced scientist, a man who, by all rights, should be dead. Pietro believed otherwise, and while he trusted in his pupil, he'd done his own research. What he'd managed to dig up hadn't been pleasant. Watts was the worst sort of man. Arrogant, vengeful, and worst of all, greedy. But again, why strike at him? They'd never met. He would have remembered a mustache like that. Blue eyes flitted back to Jacques' dossier, considering a new angle. Were they working together? He tapped at his desk with one finger. It seemed unlikely. And yet the notion nagged at him. It was possible. Unlikely, but possible. Maybe they wanted him to go after James. Should he track them down, root them out and demand answers? The prospect was tempting. No, he shook his head. That would leave his family unprotected. Saffron was strong, but she was also very distracted at the moment, thanks in no small part to Pyrrha. Sable and Sabrina were still volatile. Valen cared only for her training. The others were too young. Those who weren't lacked the strength to take command in his absence. Juniper was good, she was very good, but he wasn't willing to leave her with the kids. His finger stopped tapping. Child could do it. But she's gotten so unpredictable lately. Little bundle of chaos, that girl. He'd need to keep an eye on her. Why Juniper had insisted on naming one of their girls that, he'd never know. Slim arms wrapped around him, enfolding him in a warm embrace. Naruto found his thoughts slipping as something soft pressed against his shoulders. Come back to bed, love. Juniper's voice was the sweetest melody, her lips caressing the outer lobe of his ear. I'm cold. Naruto blew out a sigh, snuffed out the candle, and let her tug him out his chair. Sorry, didn't mean to worry you. Worry. She laughed and kissed his cheek. You can worry me all night long. Heat crept up the back of his neck. Insatiable succubus. Juniper. Laughter trickled through the night. He could wrangle more answers in the morning. Now if John could just stay out of trouble a little while longer. So long as he didn't catch anyone's attention. 0.0.0.0. Pyrrha was sulking. John could see it in the twitch of her jaw. Feel it as her fingers gripped his wrist. Hear it as she stalked up the steps, tugging him along behind her. He could have broken her grip at any time, tore his arm free and bolted for safety. But he didn't. He felt no need. It was both confusion and curiosity that held him back. John knew she was sulky. Even blind man could see that. But for the life of him, he just couldn't figure out why. Had he done something to upset her? Nothing came to mind. Things had been good. Better than good. He was settling in, making friends, finding his way through lessons with decent grades. Weiss was not exactly friend to him these days per se, but not frosty either. Better yet, neither of them had been called up for a spar since their bout last week. Funny how 7 days could just fly by like that. So why was Pyrrha taking him up to the roof now in the middle of the night? And why did she have her weapons? Moreover, why did he need his? Kurama creaked an eye open and uttered a jaw-popping yawn. I thought that would be obvious. John groaned inwardly. Enlighten me. Nope. Came the cackle. More fun this way. John knew he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. Hell, he'd be the first to admit this fatal flaw in himself. His sisters often ran rings around him outside of combat. He could fight really well, but while he held an excellent grasp in the realm of tactics and warfare, other concepts escaped him. Still, having so many sisters made him more adroit in other areas, too. Pyrrha. His voice warbled a little when he nearly missed a step. Are you mad? No. She wouldn't look at him as she eased the door open. Whatever gave you that idea? Softer, she muttered something else under her breath. Sneaky schnee. John frowned. What did Weiss have to do with this? Really? You're asking that? You held her after she lost to you. Is it any wonder someone noticed? His brow furrowed further, growing stormy with confusion. What was there to notice? Her aura had been exhausted at the time. She might have hurt herself or worse, dashed her skull against the ground. Why was everyone reading into every little thing he did? Kurama only laughed all the louder. In the end he let Pyrrha lead him out because they were most certainly outside now and found at least one question answered. A final door parted before them. Then he found himself looking up at the shattered moon, at the distant spire of Beacon Tower in the distance. A brief glance merely confirmed his suspicions. She'd led him out to one of the many rooftops that dotted the dorms. He could see the faint glimmering light of an open window below them, a light that slammed off the moment they drew near. Higher. She jolted a little when he used her nickname. Was it something I did? Pyrrha Nikos did not huff, but she did let go of his hand and move to the edge of the roof. Everybody panic. Oi. Pyrrha, don't. He made a blind grab, caught her by the shoulder and pulled her back. I know you're going through a hard time, but this isn't the answer. You have so much to live for. What are you talking about? No. Her face drained of all color as she realized what he meant. That's not why I brought you up here. She wriggled free, stepped back from the edge and gripped her left wrist hard enough to make the bone creak. I wanted to ask you something. I didn't come up here to do that. John released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. All right. Go on. He stabbed both hands in his pockets, fighting down a tremor of relief. Shoot. She dithered for a moment, looked him dead in the eye, and did just that. In that last fight, you held back, didn't you? John's world ground to a halt. Panic bleated through his brain, drowning out any and all hope of sense. She knew. He didn't know how, but she did. Kurama shouted something at him, but he couldn't hear the old fox over the roaring in his ears. He had to leave. That meant knocking her out, but what then? She'd tell everyone. Did he take her with him? Oh gods, Dad would kill him. And that's all right. Pretty redhead say what now? The world reasserted itself, leaving the faint taste of sick in John's mouth. He choked it down. Pyrrha must have said something else in the interim, but he didn't hear her. He was too startled. John, she stepped forward and touched a hand to his shoulder. It's all right, his teammate reiterated. I understand. You do. He choked once, swallowed, then shook his head. No, wait, how did you? It wasn't hard. Her hand came away from his shoulder to gesture grandly. You hesitated at key moments, she counted down on her fingers. More than once I saw you catch yourself, move slower than you should. You could have ended that bout at least 9 different ways, but you let her aura bleed out instead. He'd hit his cheeks. Well, yeah, I could have handled it a bit better. Because you were training her. She finished with a knowing air. Know what? She knew nothing. John's jaw clicked open and snapped shut thrice as fast. Training Weiss. Helping her. Him. He didn't have any of that in mind at the time. Shameful as it sounded, he'd been far too busy enjoying himself, relishing the chance to fight. Maybe Pyrrha didn't have the whole picture. Maybe that was a good thing. If she thought he'd been pulling his punches, if she didn't know the truth of what he really was, if she didn't see. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it was. His anxiety began to evaporate. This was a horrid misunderstanding, but anything was better than him being outed. That's why I want to fight you. His partner put in. At your best. The anxiety came crashing back through the door. It brought roommates. Red, say what now? We can train up here, after class. She chirruped, missing his confusion entirely. Where no one can bother us. John bit back a groan. Why did everyone want to fight him? Was this a rite of passage or something? And why was Kurama cackling in the back of his head? John, everybody needs a little push from time to time. Mistaking his silence for reluctance, Pyrrha prattled on. It doesn't make you any different from the rest of us. You made it to Beacon. That speaks volumes of what you're capable of. Her eyes all but shone with glee. We all saw your skill. John winced. This was the moment. He could tell her the truth. Open up. Surely she'd understand. You're wrong. A little voice bleated in the back of his head. I don't belong here. I wasn't really accepted into Beacon. I didn't go to combat school. I didn't pass any tests. I didn't earn my spot at this academy. I lied. I got my hands on some fake transcripts and I lied, just to fulfill my dream. But he couldn't. He didn't dare. It would ruin everything. And he wasn't ready to give this up. Yeah. Instead, he scratched the back of his head, forced a smile to his face, fake as false glass. I guess you're right. I'm not normal either, John. That got him blinking for all the wrong reasons. My family, there's a reason I left Mistral. Green eyes rose, holding his. Left them. I didn't want anything to do with their legacy. I didn't want to be their champion. She scuffed a foot against the rooftop, tried to speak, then thought better of it. You're running from something too, aren't you? Her words struck dangerously close to home. Come on, a little late night exercise will do wonders for your spirit. She bounded once on her heels. It always does for me. John shelved his suspicions. You just wanna fight me, don't you? Perhaps. Her smile was almost cheeky. Is that something a normal girl would do? Unbidden, he found himself returning it, all too eager for a distraction. Oh, you're gonna get it. He'd explain eventually. Honest, he would. He just needed the right words. But here, now, he couldn't. And so he made the first move, striking at her shoulders in a vicious, if telegraphed arc she was almost certain to see and counter. Pyrrha's shield whistled at his head in a bronze discus of death, forcing him to abort his charge or risk being shortened by a head. John was quick to turn out of its path and quicker still to raise his shield when it came back around. He slapped it out of the air when it boomeranged back, only to wince when she twisted it at the last seconds, stinging his fingers. Hey! He recoiled with a wince. His partner winced. I'm sorry. Pyrrha really was, she only ever threw her shield when she was angry. Just another one of her tells. She wasn't a bad person. She just got a little too intense sometimes. Thankfully she couldn't do the same to his weapons. Chakra metal couldn't be manipulated by whatever the hell her semblance was. Pyrrha called it polarity, but it seemed more magnetism than anything else. She rarely used it, and he could see why. In a world where nearly everyone used metal weapons, her semblance was a literal life hack, one she refused to use on anyone's weapon. At least she had a semblance. He still didn't know what his was, or if he'd ever unlock it. Perhaps that was vain of him, with all his gifts and powers, to want more. But he did. Every huntsman had a semblance. Even jerks like Cardin. Of course, he couldn't tell anyone that he didn't have a semblance, because everyone assumed he did. His so-called semblance allowed him to explain away all his esoteric abilities. Pyrrha closed with him again and such thoughts shattered as their shields struck. They collided in a steady percussion of blows, steel striking steel, the crackle of dust and chakra. Pyrrha was on an entirely different level than Weiss. You hit her, and she hit back twice as hard. She was a red and bronze dervish of death, and against her unrestrained strength, John found he actually had to try. It was glorious. Fun, even. She gave as good as she got, meeting him almost blow for blow. Chambering a kick, she vaulted off his shield and landed behind him. John whirled to meet her, already knowing she had the drop on him. He could have sped away, but he didn't. Instead he leaned in and let her blade whistle by. Several golden hairs fluttered to the ground. His eyes widened. Had she gotten faster just now? He blurred with a roar, and Pyrrha matched it with a cry of her own. Her sword tickled the underside of his chin. In the same moment he pressed the inert hilt of Crocea Morse to her stomach. Pyrrha looked down and balked. In a real fight, a single flick of his finger would have ignited the blade and run her through. Thankfully he had more control of his weapon than most. A rare grin flitted past his lips at the reminder. Gasping for air, bodies slicked in sweat, neither moved. Pyrrha swallowed, and John, his senses still hypersensitive from their bout, watched a tiny bead of sweat roll down her chin, race across her neck and plunge into the valley of her jaw. Bad brain. Blackest betrayal. Most foul treachery. His gaze snapped up hastily, only to find her admiring his chest, eyes half-lidded. Green eyes met his and flitted away anxiously, caught in the act, just as he had been. Well fought. You fight good. John cursed himself for the slip and clamped his mouth shut, but it was too late to take the words back. Damn it. Not his tongue, too. Pyrrha perked up. Better than Weiss. The answer seemed obvious. Well, yeah. Way more intense. Weiss liked to retreat and fight from a higher ground, use her glyphs to barrage her opponent and wear them down. Not so Pyrrha. She got right up in your face. There was no time to think or strategize, just the mindless whirl of combat and the prayer that you were fast enough to keep up. Anyone else would have been mowed down. It was only his genes and the ruthless training he'd endured that allowed him to stand against her in the first place. Pyrrha made happy Pyrrha noises and settled back into a stance. Again. John nearly guffawed, yet found himself mirroring her regardless. You're not tired. She smiled, a pure girlish thing that made her seem more real, somehow. I'm told I have a lot of stamina. At some unspoken signal they lunged again. Maybe he was living a lie. Maybe it was selfish of him to cling to it. Maybe this would ruin everything someday. But not today. 0.0.0.0. Ozpin considered the footage. Rewound it. Once. Twice. Considered it again. Keen eyes watched images of initiation, paired with last week's duel. Perhaps it had been foolish of him to put cameras in the training room. That had been a lifetime ago. So many lives ago, when Beacon was all too new, and the agents of Salem were everywhere. That threat may have lessened with time, but the danger Salem posed had not. He raised the mug to his lips, drank deeply, and frowned as he watched. Did the Arc Boy have magic? He didn't want to consider it, and yet the notion persisted. Those skills went beyond a mere semblance, they defied the realm of possibility, of imagination itself. For all his failures, did he not have children after Salem? Before he split his power, before the maidens. He certainly had, but he'd believed that bloodline long extinguished. Salem had seen to it, or so he'd thought. Was it possible? Had she missed one? He considered Ark's profile anew. It seemed almost too good to be true. The eyes, the shape of his face, the way he carried himself, and those unexplained skills. His mug fell from his fingers and clattered to the floor, spilling hot chocolate on his shoes. Ozpin scarcely noticed. In the end, only one awful thought occurred to. Does this make me a great-grandfather? 0.0.0.0. A scroll rang in the dark. Someone retrieved it from the table. You failed. An angry rasp greeted them. Don't disappoint me again. 0.0.0.0. You're staring again, Ruby. Am I? Came the happy chirrup. Am I really? Yes. Weiss fought down a yawn as she ran a comb through her hair. Her reflection gazed back at her, and her partner behind it. Is there something you'd like to ask me? Say what you would about Ruby Rose, but she had far too much energy in the morning. Her illustrious leader didn't so much leap out of her bunk as she did vault, landing at her side in a cloud of red petals. Weiss waved them away with a glyph and continued her routine, refusing to be budged. RWBY was doing all the budging. You're not still mad at John, are you? Ice blue eyes rolled. No, RWBY. 'Cause it's been a week and all, and you've barely talked to him. A long suffering sigh. Yes, RWBY. Honestly. Her partner meant well, but she could be such a child at times. So, are you and John cool now, or? He is a capable combatant. She allowed at last. Silver eyes flashed with glee. Not what you said earlier. He'd hit her face like a physical slap. Well, no one was perfect. Not even her. Besides, he'd helped to not unlock her semblance, for she already had it, but to, what was the word? Progress. Evolve. Ha. Perhaps that was the word. She was making great strides there. Am I not allowed a mistake? No, no, no. Her remark threw her partner on the back foot. Of course you are. There was more to little Ruby Rose than met the eye. In a fight, she was downright vicious. But socially, well, the results spoke for themselves. Ark was more than he appeared, too. She understood that now. Beneath the facade of an affable fool lay a cunning warrior. She had seen the mask lift in the heat of battle, if only for a moment. The fire in his eyes as they had raged back and forth across the arena, the impeccable poise with which he fought. He wasn't some brute swinging a sword around. He was trained. But by whom? She had trained with the finest blademasters this side of the world. Father's money was actually good for something, and she didn't recognize his style. Still, if he had that kind of training, why leave home? His skills must have been valued, surely. Perhaps he'd come to Beacon to escape from something as well. Perhaps she had misjudged him. Perhaps. She scowled a little when her comb caught a snag in her hair. Gently, gracefully, she plucked it out. Time would tell, and the next time they faced one another, Weiss swore to have a few tricks of her sleeve. Now that she had awakened to the true potential of her semblance, so too did she intend to milk her new skills for all they were worth. Perhaps another visit to the Emerald Forest was in order. If she killed enough memorable foes, she'd have an army to fling at him in their second bout. Winter might even answer her calls and visit. Oh, she couldn't wait to show her sister how far she'd progressed. But it wouldn't do to count her chickens before they hatched. First she needed to train, and for that she would need dust, which meant a visit to Vale, which meant a chance to observe those arriving for the vital festival. Two birds with one stone. Ha! Sometimes she amazed even herself. She's laughing again. Just leave her. She's lost in her own little world. Weiss snapped back to reality with a scowl. I heard that. RWBY hummed. Yeah, well, you didn't hear what else we said. Hey. Yang chortled as she sprawled out on her bed. Smug RWBY is best RWBY. Weiss brandished her comb as one might a rapier. You be quiet. Never. I don't see what all the fuss is about. Ah, and here at last their resident recluse finally piped in. John is a faunus. There's nothing exceptional about it. Yang and RWBY exchanged a baffled look. He is. You didn't notice. Blake reined her temper in. How else do you explain those whiskers? A human wouldn't have those. The sisters shrugged. Birthmark. He can see near perfectly in the dark. Blake barreled on. Remember when the power went out? Weiss opened her mouth to refute such a ridiculous statement, then closed it. Those whiskered cheeks were rather distinctive. If he truly was a faunus, then he'd been rather kind. Most spat in her direction. Perhaps he'd learned to rise above such petty prejudice. If so, that was another point in his favor. Huh. Yang's grins promised mischief. Maybe he is. Wonder if he has any other features under the hood. Weiss nearly choked on her own spit. Xiao Long. RWBY, pure, innocent RWBY, offered an innocuous blink. Under the hood. Yang gestured. Well, you know. Blake's boot belted Yang in the face, sending her partner tumbling out her bunk with a yelp. That's not how it works. Yes, Weiss rolled her eyes at their shenanigans. Well, I suppose some exceptional souls can rise above their fellows. Blake bridled. And what does that mean? Weiss shrugged. Merely that he surprised me, that's all. She returned to brushing her hair. Dotton failed to see Blake glaring at her back. Perhaps had she done so, she might have spared herself a great indignity in the days to come. 0.0.0.0. Rise and shine, sleepyhead. Someone thumped him over the head with a pillow. It's morning. John rolled over with a groan. Nora. No. Bad Nora. It's a weekend. Go away. No can do, Buster. Strong hands pried the pillow away, followed by the sheets. You've got a visitor. She came all the way from the outskirts of Vale to see her brother. Brother. Funny how one word can wake a man up. Icy awareness crashed down John like a waterfall. He stretched out his senses and caught chakra. Familiar chakra. No. It couldn't be. Kurama stilled in his head, then ducked for cover. Good luck. Hiding now. A dark blue eye creaked open. He soon wished it hadn't. Hello, brother of mine. Bright scarlet eyes met his across the room, framed by a halo of blonde hair and a cherubic smile. Enjoying our vacation, she took a deep, hearty bite of the riot red apple in her hand. Are we? Another bite came and went, drawing a wince from him. You were quite difficult to find. Another bite, her teeth nearly clicking together in quiet anger. I had to stir up all sorts of chaos to track you down. Worse, she was sitting in Pyrrha's lap like she owned it. And her green eyes met his, utterly unaware of her peril. You never told me you had such an adorable sister, John. She's very well behaved. Ren chimed in. URK. John managed eloquently. How had she even gotten in here? Had Ozpin just let her waltz right in? All wrapped up in the sort of uniform one might expect of a young prep girls' school, this child looked every bit an innocent angel. He didn't want to know who she'd stolen it from. This little waif looked younger than her true age would suggest, but John wasn't fooled. Not for a second. Why her? Why did it have to be her of all people? He would have taken Valen any day over her. Even Azula, fiery as she was. Well, child, the most dangerous of all the Ark children, smiled at him. Nothing else to say. He choked. Of all the sisters to find him. Hey, big sis. Why you ask? Doom. That's why. Doom was upon him. Doom upon his head, doom upon the dorm, doom upon his life. Doom. Damnation. Destruction. All of it his. He was dead. He was going to die. Dead men be he. A cornucopia of pain and despair was here to ensure his imminent demise. Maybe he was having a bit of a panic attack. Was this a panic attack? It felt like a panic attack. Sure, fine, that was great. Just dandy. But really, could you blame him? Oh, dear. Child tented her fingers as she regarded him from her perch in Pyrrha's lap. You don't look happy to see me, John. Why ever would that be? Every reason. All the reasons. His eyes strayed toward the unguarded window. He contemplated lunging at it, crashing through it. He'd hit the ground running, and never look back. He was strong. He was fast. He was certain he could get away if he really wanted to. It was only the knowledge of what would happen after that prevented him from doing so. That would mean abandoning Beacon, and in doing so forsaking all the friends he'd made here. Cutting ties. Severing bonds. An image of Pyrrha's grief-stricken face flashed through his mind. Followed by the others. Pyrrha, Nora, Ren, Team RWBY, everyone. He couldn't do it. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, biting through his gloves hard enough to hurt. The pain centered him. Maybe that made him even more of a coward, wanting to cling to something that wasn't real. Pretending to be normal, when he was anything but. Some might call it a poor hill to die on. But it was his choice. Blue eyes hardened into steely sapphires. His dear sister must have seen it too, because she smiled. Not going to run, little brother. She touched one finger to the side of her cheek. I'd give you a head start. No. It was the right answer. Her smile grew smug. This would be the second greatest fight of his life, if only because it wasn't something he could win with his fists. He felt an age-old creep into his bones. Each and every Ark child was powerful in their own right. There could be no denying that. They all had their talents. Some were more specialized than others. Valen preferred the art of the blade for instance, relying on it more than her own powers. Likewise, Saffron preferred to rely on her sheer stamina and superior strength to carry the day. Azula preferred her flames, while Jean could win hearts and minds with nothing but a smile and an inspiring speech. John had sought to broaden his horizons in the hopes of making up for what he lacked. Child. Dot was a force unto herself. Maybe it was the mysterious circumstances of her birth. Perhaps she'd taken after Kurama a little too well. She might have just been born. Off, like Sable and Sabrina were. Regardless, it didn't spell well that she was here in his room. She'd always been the most emotional and chaotic of them all but able to change her shape at will. If she lashed out here, he'd have no choice but to fight or run. No, that wasn't an potion. It was beginning to look like it would be the former. Kurama would be of no help here. He was on his own. May we have a moment? John floundered and felt the floor lurch beneath him. Then again, that might have been his stomach. The sudden realization that he might not have to fight brought with a crushing wave of relief. And shame. He didn't want to fight his family. Win or lose, it felt like he'd lose something irreplaceable if he came to blows with his sisters. Certainly. Pyrrha smiled, not realizing just who she was leaving him with. Just remember, we have that trip to Forever Fall tomorrow. John shook his head fiercely. Don't leave me alone with her. She saw it. Is something wrong? Child's eyes flashed. He saw a single scarlet tail sprout from her back, just visible enough for him to see, and him alone. His defiance deflated. Never mind. Don't mind him. Child gripped his arm. He's shy. She looked between them and dared a reluctant nod. Well, if you're sure it's all right. Come, Ren took Nora by the arm. Let's give them some privacy. She put up a struggle, but I wanted to watch. Pyrrha was the last to leave, eyes lingering. The door closed, sealing his fate. Child waited a full total of 3 seconds, making certain they'd gone out of earshot. Brother. Finally, she released him, clasped both hands behind her back and turned to face him entirely. Whatever am I going to do with you? Nothing. John fought down his rising gorge and plastered what he hoped prayed was a winning smile onto his face. I'm happy to see you and all, but I have things under control. Look, he continued, choosing his every word with the utmost of great care, I know why you're here and it's not necessary. His beloved sister favored him with a cherubic smile. I am here because you have made my presence necessary. Oh gods. Fight or flight returned with a vengeance. Sis, I'm fine. You don't need to do anything. 5 transparent tails of scarlet light swayed to life behind her. No, I think I do. John lunged before she could, caught her by the right arm and wrenched said limb down behind her back. With the other, he hoisted her smaller body into the air, pinning her against the nearest wall he could find. It wouldn't have been possible had she reverted to her true appearance. Her true body was both taller and stronger than him. But for reasons he didn't truly understand, the little shapeshifter liked being seen as a child. She wouldn't let go of this guise if she could help it. Her pride wouldn't allow her. And so he used it to his advantage. I won't go back. So you say. Rather than cry out, his sister made a pleased noise against the plaster. Maybe you have gotten a little stronger. But only a little. Her free hand twisted in a seal he didn't recognize. Whatever it did blasted him backward into a wall. Something cracked and it wasn't his back. His feet hadn't yet struck the carpet when a crimson tail caught him by the throat and slammed him facefirst into floor. Stars burst before his vision. A tiny foot crushed against his back, forcing his nose to become intimate with it in a way no self-respecting shinobi desired. Look at you. She tutted, leaning over him. Wasted and gasping for air. Still not using your full potential. Father taught you better than this. Stop holding back. Blue eyes blazed red. His back bucked and though he didn't move an inch, his shirt burst as 9 golden chakra tails sprang to life. Child stumbled, balance denied, in an instant the tables turned. He writhed upright, drove a fist into her solar plexus, caught her by the face as she doubled over, and rammed her into one of the beds. Those golden tethers crashed down, all but shackling her to the frame, limbs and all. A beat of silence passed between brother and sister. Impressive. She offered a low whistle as the mattress creaked beneath her. Most impressive. You've made your point. He grit his teeth, stifling the reflexive urge to rage. You need to fix that wall. I'll do it, if you let me up first. Came her glib retort. What's to stop you from attacking me again? I wasn't going to, silly. Her lips pursed in a pout much like her namesake. You struck first. John didn't budge. Oh, very well. She bit her lip and drew blood, leaving a thin bead of blood to run down her chin. There. Blood oath. Happy now. Reluctantly he released her. Odnu eht egamad. Undo the damage. She snapped her fingers, muttered some words in reverse, and the cratered wall sealed itself. There. Right as rain. Not at all. His mind was whirling, heart hammering a mile a minute. He didn't dare let go of his full might for fear of her lashing out again. Child was incomprehensible. He couldn't understand his sister's motives any more than he did here these days. I'll be happy when you leave. Leave. You're confused. Her smile grew. I'm not here to retrieve you. John's heart skipped a beat. What? I'm here to observe you. What? Once I finish vetting your team, of course. She raised her arms, folding them before her chest. It's nothing personal. I need to make sure they meet your standards. And mine. What? Speaking of which, it would seem you have the redhead firmly under your thumb. She winked at him. Feisty, that one. Loyal, too. My kinda girl. Mother would approve. For a wild moment he actually imagined Pyrrha meeting Juniper fawning over baby pictures together. His throat closed. Were partners. Weren't they? Are you, though? She tilted her head, golden tresses falling over a scarlet eye. Are you really? It seems to me that she wants to be more than that. Frankly, I'm amazed you haven't accidentally seduced half the campus by now. It's been fascinating to watch you stumble through everyday life here. Watch. Humiliation. Thy name is John. When did you? Brother, isn't it obvious? Her eyes pulsed with quiet power. Did you really think I came to you first? I've been here for days. She'd concealed herself from him, and he'd never noticed. His face burned redder than Ruby's namesake. This was not happening. He'd gladly take a brawl over this scathing cross-examination. When you ran away, I was so upset. She prattled on. Where did he go? I wondered. Why would he do such a thing? And then I understood. She touched one hand to her chest. You were lonely. I wasn't there for you, John. I failed you, not only as a sister, but as a woman. There she goes. She's off on one of her tangents. I thought you were hiding. Still am. I understand, John. Really, I do. Child stepped to him and for a moment her very being seemed to shift, gaining height and mass where there had been hardly any before. You were lost. Confused. She touched a hand to his cheek once, then her form snapped back, leaving him looking down at her once more and hand resting near his ribs. And it's all my fault. That changes now. I'm here for you. I wasn't lost. He bridled at her tone and patted her hand away. I made a choice. This was my decision. She sighed. Then you made a poor decision, brother of mine. You're living a lie here. I wonder how long this fiasco will last. Was she trying to provoke him? Fiasco. I've got this under control. No, his chaotic sibling shook her head. I think fiasco is the appropriate term. In fact, your entire tenure here has been quite the fiasco. That ends now. Child blurred. John tensed. Her head hit his chest. Slim arms took hold of his torso and held tight. I'm here to look out for you, little brother. John's back stiffened, mind still fearing a trick. Any moment now her hand would knife into the side of his neck and knock him out. Or she'd conjure forth her tails, grab him, and run off. Any one of his sisters would have done the same. Valen alone could have stunned him and hauled him back to Ansel by the ear. So why wasn't Child doing the same? What was her motive? For the life of him, he couldn't grasp it. Well, she muttered into his chest, distracting him. Aren't you going to hug your favorite sister? John nearly choked on his own spit. Favorite? In what world? Still, he recognized the implicit plea for what it was and dared to wrap his arms around her. Child latched harder, all but burying her face into his shirt as she basked in his presence. She'd always been clingy, but this was harmless enough, right? Much better. She lifted her smiling visage, preening like a peacock. I needed a recharge. Now that we've gotten that bit of pleasantry out of the way. Quick as a flash she grabbed him by the ear and hauled him down to look her in the eye. Furious scarlet slits bored into startled blue. If you ever, she rasped, and I mean ever run off like that without telling me again, I will make you rue the day. Embarrassing, but not so ghastly as the punishment he'd perceived. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Her voice trembled with emotion. Do not test me. His words died with a gurgle. In any case, you'll need to be much, much stronger if you want to stay here. She tugged him down to regard him. If I figured out where you were, it's only a matter of time until father does the same. Then what will you do? A tan hand pinched his whiskered cheek. He won't be swayed, not like me. Do you have any plans? I will cross that bridge when I come to it. John. What else can I do? His temper sparked at last, filling him with hopeless despair. I can't beat him in a fair fight. None of us can. I know, brother mine. I know. For once, she almost seemed sad. Even now, there's a part of me that wants to drag you home, if only to spare you from what's to come. It would be like trying to fight a hurricane. He knew that. They both did. You could help me fight him. Nope. She smacked her lips. That's off the table. I'm not the one in trouble here. Ah, you sound like RWBY. The little devil tilted her head. And that is. No, no, no. He wasn't letting her anywhere near that little cinnamon roll. Still, it would be remiss of me to leave you without a gift. She pulled the headband from her hair and offered it to him. Here. What's this? A gift. She pushed it into his hands. Just hold it and call my name if you need me. I'll come running. His brow furrowed. What? Like a portal? I've never heard of a jutsu like that. Her smile was telling. Well, it's not a jutsu per se. You've been messing with magic again. Dad's gonna be mad. Come now, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. And don't sulk. She kissed his forehead, as she hadn't done since he was little. If nothing else, we have the present moment. Try as he might, he didn't have the heart to push her away when she pulled him in for a hug. Child hummed and tucked his head into her chest. There's the brother I know. 0.0.0.0. Ozpin paused well short of Team JNPR's door. This was the moment. He'd finally marshaled his courage to speak with him. He must before it was too late. All told, the idea of having a descendant was something he'd considered before. The door swung open, forcing him to take 3 steps back. A young girl emerged from within. Idly, he noticed her uniform, pale blonde hair, and striking red eyes. She turned and closed it quickly behind her. Not quickly enough. He glimpsed John Ark within, head in his hands. His expression looked nothing short of despondent. And then the door was closed, denying him his brief glimpse into the life of the boy who may or may not be of his blood. Thank you for your hospitality, good sir. In exchange, the strange girl dipped a shallow curtsy at him. I'll be visiting again, if it's not too much trouble. Hospitality. He'd never seen this girl before in his life. His gaze zeroed in on her uniform and failed to recognize it. At a glance, it might be mistaken for academy attire. He knew better. It was a decent facsimile, but his eyes were not so easily fooled. More than that, something about her manners instantly threw him off. You're welcome. And you are. I go by many names. She smoothed her skirt with a cherubic smile. I prefer child, if it's all the same to you. I see. He humored her with a small smile. And what is the purpose of your visit? Merely visiting my little brother. Ozpin took a moment to drink from his mug. The action hid his frown. What manner of madness compelled someone to name their offspring that of all things? He chortled a little and let her go. Child, indeed. Almost sounded like something Salem would do back in the day. She'd ever been horrible with names. Gods above, she'd wanted to name their daughters after the seasons. Hot chocolate sprayed from his lips. Blonde hair. Red eyes. Hold. He spun with a cry only to find the girl nowhere before his eyes. It was a long hallway and she couldn't have gotten into any of the adjacent dorms without a scroll. She'd simply vanished from his senses. As if she'd never been there at all. Surely it was a coincidence, wasn't it? His paranoid mind whirled. There was another angle. One he'd not considered until this very moment. Had one of their daughters survived that night? It was possible, too much to hope for, but possible. Neither of them had checked the bodies, they'd been in no state to do so. She'd immolated him, and he could only assume she'd fled the scene. Or perhaps Salem had simply had a dalliance. Questions loomed before him, impossibly large, with no answers to be found. He desperately wanted to dismiss the latter. Salem wasn't the sort to simply sleep about, he hoped. They'd not seen one another for hundreds of years. But if one of their girls had survived, and gone on to have a family, and then a family from that family, so on and so forth. Impossible. It had to be. Salem adored her children. If she had any descendants, she'd not let them out of her sight. Was it possible then? Did she truly not know of them? He certainly didn't. Neither option was appealing. Either they were of his blood, or hers. Or both. Regardless, some added protection might well avail Mr. Ark. He really did need to get to the bottom of things with that boy, but there was still so much to do. He could approach him now. This was clearly a moment of weakness. In another life, he would have forever fall, he decided. He would wait until they returned from their field trip. And if those two truly were of Salem's brood, he couldn't bring himself to kill them. Not without talking to them first. His mind made up, the immortal performed a swift about-face and marched away. Curse him for being a coward. 0.0.0.0. Did a head count. Juniper's face was decidedly cross at breakfast the next morning. One of the girls is missing. Care to guess who? Naruto's head sacked the table as he groaned. He knew who. If it's her, she'll be fine. Better than fine. It would take more than a few grim to harm her. And if she tracked down John, all the better. What could possibly go wrong? Maybe I should call. 0.0.0.0. Forever Fall was eerie in its beauty. Red as far as the eye could see, and not a leaf of green among them. Truth be told, John found it all unsettling, and not at all for the reasons one might think. A distant part of him did find it lovely, really. The rest of him was simply focused elsewhere. On other things. Things that involved a great deal of stress and pain that were probably even now headed his way. Even now, Child's parting remark haunted him. There's a part of me that wants to drag you home, if only to spare you from what's to come. Spare him, she said. Dad was going to find him. It was only a matter of time. Somehow he'd always known that, but her presence in Beacon made it more real somehow. He might be able to talk down most of his sisters, even overpower some under the right circumstances, but Dad. John fought down a shiver. When Dad had his mind set on something, nothing could shake him. He would come for him, sooner or later. If he was lucky, the old man would do so alone. If he wasn't, he'd drag Mom and the girls into this. He wasn't sure which was worse. Dad he couldn't fight, but Mom. The latter is worse. Definitely the latter. He scowled. Fat load of good you were back there. Oi. I helped you when you needed it. Surely that counts for something. His scroll vibrated in his pocket. He didn't dare answer it and he slammed a fist against the device. The call ceased. Come along now, students. Miss Goodwitch called ahead of them, breaking him from his fog. The forest of Forever Fall is indeed beautiful, but we are not here to sightsee. Professor Peach has asked all of you to collect a jar of sap. And I'm here to make sure that none of you die while doing so. To that end, we've enlisted the aid of Team CFVY to make certain there are no incidents. Well, that explained the presence of an honest-to-goodness second-year team, at least. It did not, however, explain why Velvet Scarlatina was staring at him. John could feel her gaze boring into his shoulders like a drill. Worse, she looked away the moment he tried to look at her. For the life of him, he didn't know what to make of it. Was she afraid of him after what he'd done to Cardin? Come to think of it, he could feel Bigger Boy staring at him, too. Glaring, more like. Should he feel guilty? Apologize? Under any other circumstances, John might have tried to puzzle it all out. Now. He palmed his forehead with a sigh. This really isn't my day. How little he knew. In theory today should have been. Each first-year student, himself included, was required to gather jar of sap for Professor Peach. Likewise, a member of Team CFVY had been assigned watch over each group for reasons he didn't understand. One for RWBY, a second for CRDL, and a third for JNPR. The fourth and final member would be held back in reserve, rotating with Glinda and Port in case of emergency. All in all, their presence was an extra layer of security for each of them, unnecessary though it might be. Simple, no. Not so in practice. Guess who JNPR got? First two guesses don't count. Collecting sap had seemed like such an easy task at first, everyone split off to do it. Not far mind you, just out of sight, and close enough to holler for help if need be, but once occurred to them to fear for their own safety. Why would they be? They were going to be hunters and huntresses after all. A few grim were hardly enough to scare them. But there were other things to fear in the forest. John resisted the urge to look over his shoulder as he drove a spigot into another tree. Is she still watching us? Kurama uttered a jaw-popping yawn. Yup. It's been 5 minutes. You up? Ah. A low sigh stole out of him as he filled up another jar. Couldn't hurt to have more. If anything, it was probably a good idea, given Nora's sweet tooth. Forewarned was forearmed and all that. He'd already gathered at least 5 in the last few minutes alone, if only because it gave him an excuse to stare anywhere but at her. Do you think Velvet's afraid of me? Why would she possibly be afraid of you? He grimaced. Well, I did beat Cardin down right in front of her and all. For some reason, his uncle found that hilarious. The laughter that followed left his ears ringing. What? He dug a finger into one in a vain attempt to restore his hearing. What did I say? Let me put it this way, she's thirsting for a tall glass of water. Did she not have enough to drink? A tall, blonde glass of water. Came the clarification. John flung up his arms. That doesn't make a lick of sense. The old fox only laughed all the louder. Don't worry. You'll figure it out soon. I have faith. You do. I don't. Doubling down, John returned to the task at hand, heedless of his body's protest. Blasted Nosed was starting to think he was allergic to this stuff, his eyes were stinging and his throat felt scratchy. He'd faced down worse colds before. So long as he didn't get any on his face or sage forbid, guzzle the stuff down like Nora did, he'd be fine. To be fair, Velvet Scarlatina wasn't doing anything untoward. She'd just been watching him like a skittish rabbit. If he tried to talk to her now, she'd probably bolt. Ain't that a little rude there, kiddo? Wah no. Gods, no. I didn't mean it like that. Nothing further from the truth. John felt bad for her. Something was clearly bothering her. He couldn't well glare at an upperclassman, so he settled for taking the spigot and slamming into another tree instead. I mean, if she'd just talked to me instead of standing there, lost in the web of his thoughts, he failed to see her ears twitch his way, then this would be so much easier. A hand tugged on his sleeve. Without a thought, John batted it away. Not now, Nora. The tugging intensified. So too did his scowl. Nora, no. You can't have the sap. She outright yanked on his sleeve. John rounded on her. Nora. Doe brown eyes met his, framed by an adorable scowl, long chestnut hair, and familiar rabbit ears. Arms crossed before her bosom, right foot tapping impatiently against the ground, producing a steady thump thump thump. All in all, it did precious little to help the image. His heart sank somewhere down to the vicinity of his stomach. Not Nora. Definitely not Nora. Panic seized his tongue and for an awful moment, he couldn't bring himself to speak. Velvet, right. Her head bobbed once, and the glimmer of anger faded from her eyes. I'm sorry. I couldn't help but overhear you. All the color drained from John's face, taking every bit of blood and courage with it. URK. Wish granted, but not at all in the way he'd wanted. His hands slammed together as he bowed his head. I'm so sorry. What? No. Velvet flailed her arms at him. You don't have to be. It's my own fault for standing around like that. Color returned to his cheeks. Then we're both sorry. Right then, close enough. She pinched the bridge of her nose, spun away from him, then spun back with enough force to burn the grass at her feet. I came over here to thank you. Had he done something worth thanking? For what? Kurama absolutely cackled. Traitors, the lot them. What you did that day to Cardin. Velvet lost her nerve and began to fidget then. She looked down, knees twisting in thinly veiled anxiety. It was very brave. His face felt hot. Why? He wasn't running a fever, yet he felt uncomfortably warm. I would have done it for anybody. That was probably not the right answer here. Call him dense all you like, but John Ark wasn't stupid. He could clearly see that those words would hurt her badly, shatter both her spirit and what little confidence she'd managed to muster. And truth be told, he wouldn't have done that for just anyone. Most girls wouldn't have put up with Cardin. They would have spat and snarled, fought back at the very least. But she hadn't. And so he had. Such was what heroes hunters were meant to do. I'm glad I could help. Call it cliché, but he felt it was the safe answer. The normal answer, wasn't it? Evidently not, because Velvet's eyes actually flashed. You did more than help. Her shout nearly had him leaping back. Ever since that day, he hasn't bothered me. Her outburst expended, she looked away again, threading her fingers together. Not one look, not a single remark, not anything. And I wanted to thank you earlier, but I couldn't get up the nerve, so. She reached down into the satchel bound to her belt, nestled against her hip. Really were very nice hips, bad John. Eyes upward. Her eyes snapped to his. Had she caught him staring? Was she angry? He hadn't meant to. This is for, that is to say. I made these. Her words crashed together, but he was certain he got the gist. For you. Velvet withdrew her hands from her pouch, bowed her head low, and thrust something against John's chest. More like. His aura actually took a hit from that. The impact alone made him falter, sending him stumbling half a step backward. A faint crinkling sound hit his ears, and reflexively, his fingers closed around the parcel. His mind mused. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then another. Another still. John blinked. Cleared his throat, which suddenly felt terribly tight. His brain physically rebooted. This cannot be happening to us. It cried to his eyes. Look again. We are. His eyes hallued. It's real. She'd given him a bag of cookies. Freshly baked by the smell of them. They were still faintly warm in his hands, bound up in a nearly transparent red bag, much like her namesake. A scarlet string bound the plastic near the top, preventing it spill out in his hands. Still, a girl had just given him cookies. And with that realization, John's world came unspooled. No one outside of his family had never done this for him. Not here, not back in Ansel, not anywhere, really. Gee, I wonder why. Wasn't like you had any scary sisters to chase them away. He slapped his sassy uncle down. Is this for me? Velvet nodded stiffly, looking upon him with wide, expectant eyes. John knew what was expected of him. She was watching. Waiting. Even so. It was too much pressure. Now remember, son, Dad's voice came back to him in an instant. If a girl bakes something for you, be it cookies or chocolate, or even a cake, you have to eat it. No matter what. Doesn't matter how they taste, or if she mixed up salt with sugar, you must eat them. Do you understand? Yeah, he groused at the time, but that'll never happen to me. His father had only smiled, whiskered cheeks dimpling like they always did. Damn it, Dad. Here at last, his nerves failed him and he dithered. Velvet drooped, and her ears with her. Are you allergic? What are you doing, fool? A dozen mini Johns roared in his head. Be nice to the bunny. Nimble fingers undid the scarlet string around the wrapper and opened the bag to meet his doom. What he found there was anything but. They were in the shape of, what were those? Were they supposed to be carrots? Hearts. Both. Each cookie had a distinct shape to it, many of which he didn't recognize. Some even looked like weapons, or cookie versions of them anyway. He popped one into his mouth, kinda looked like a scythe, and bit down, resigning himself to oblivion. Sweet. Flavor exploded across his tongue and it broke him. The chocolate cookie didn't just melt into his mouth, it all but dissolved on his tongue. His hand betrayed him and snatched up another, didn't even pause so see what it looked like before flinging it into his mouth. He'd never thought to experience something like this, never known he'd wanted something so badly until he received it. They're good. Really. Her ears perked up, the hope in her eyes was too pure to behold. They almost seemed to glow with flames. I tried so many times and I was so afraid I'd mixed up sugar with salt again. John's blonde brow climbed into his hairline. Bunny, say what now? Velvet's hands flew to her face. Nothing. But I was sure I just heard. You heard nothing. Wow, she could be kinda fierce when her nerves weren't eating her alive. Without thinking, he popped another cookie into the mouth. Mistakes were made. This one was even better than the last. Caramel. How had she managed to get caramel filling into a cookie? Who knew? Not him. His mouth made a noise caught somewhere between a sigh and a whine. They're good. He sniffed out, unable to contain himself. So damn good. Now it was Velvet's turn to squint. Are you crying? No. It's just, no one's ever done this for me. Doe brown eyes blinked. No one. Sure, his sisters had made cookies a time or two, but they were usually god-awful, or filled with salt as a prank. The less said about Dad's cooking, the better. Mom had been known to bake on occasion, but therein lie the rub. She was good. Too good. With so many hungry mouths, her cookies were devoured as soon as they were made. In that, his siblings showed no mercy. But this was for him. Him and only him. It felt good. Never thought cookies would bring you to tears. Guess it takes all kinds. I'm sorry, he laughed out an apology to Kurama as much as Velvet. I sound like an idiot, don't I? No. Her eyes sparked. You don't. I kinda do. No. That was his only warning. John's every combat instinct blared a warning as Velvet's Scarlatina stepped forward. In truth, he half expected an attack when she ventured into his personal space. Maybe he'd been trained a little too well in that regard. Perhaps some habits were just too well ingrained to shake after all these years. As luck would have it, John was only half right. When the assault, when it came, was not at all what he expected it to be. He inhaled sharp, catching the faint smell of cinnamon and perfume, then she was upon him. Something warm, soft, and infinitely yielding graced his right cheek. Little more than a feather's brush. Her body pushed up against his, nearly drilling him into a nearby tree. The contact lasted all of an instant, then drew back thrice as fast, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined it in the first place. Kurama whistled like the wolf he wasn't. Sneaky girl. There. Velvet skipped backward, refusing to meet his eyes. Now you have another first. John tried to speak, but his tongue committed bloody mutiny and refused to work properly. BWUH. See you around, yeah. Her nerves must have failed her, too, because she tugged her long ears down over her eyes. It did nothing to hide her pink cheeks. She stammered out another thank you and bolted back in the other direction before he could say anything more. A distant, detached part of him mused. She really could give Ruby a run for her money when she tried to. More than that, she'd done something he was fairly certain Ruby never would. A trembling hand touched his cheek. It was still warm. Wow. First kiss, Was it? He tried in vain to recall any such event and came up short. Nothing. There really hadn't been any girls interested in him back home. The most he could recall was holding hands with a green-eyed girl when he was very young. This was, in every way, a first for him. A dopey grin spread across his visage. Wipe that silly grin off your face. Kurama gave him a swift jab. We've got company. We do. But I don't sense any. Having fun, my boy. A jolly laugh pervaded John's ears as a hand slammed down on his right shoulder, hard enough to make his aura flare. He jolted, juggled Velvet's gift for a wild moment, somehow managed to get both hands on it, and wrangled it down against his chest like a precious gem. Only then, once his heart stopped trying to leap out his throat, did he dare turn around. Familiar busy brows and a drooping mustache filled his vision. Professor Port. In truth, he'd nearly forgotten about the jolly old fellow on this trip. Port had that air about him. I see you've found yourself an admirer. The teacher cast a weather eye toward Velvet's rapidly retreating form, bolting the way he'd come. Ah, young love. Reminds me of the old days. Heat flooded John's face. Warm lips, the fullness of her figure pressed against his. It does. Indeed. Another slap on the back nearly knocked the wind clear out of him. The stories I could tell. A meaty arm draped itself over his shoulder. So many adventures. Please don't, John's brain bleated. You'll put me to sleep. An awkward pause settled between the two of them. At last, he dared to breach it. Did you need something, Professor? Now that you mention it, lad. Port pulled away, considering him for a moment. There is something you can do for me. His smile gained an edge. Think of it as an extracurricular activity, of a sort. Anything to get away from baffling man. And what might that be? Dodge. Port's axe whipped at John's head with a speed that bellied the old man's girth. In other words, far, far faster than it had any right to. He actually glimpsed his dumbstruck reflection in the bladed blunderbuss. Then reality reasserted itself. Instinct, once tightly leased, broke free and howled to the fore. John's left leg carried him forward as the right stomped down, strengthening his stance. Aura flashed, sparks skittering across his fingers. Just as well, because then he did something foolish indeed. He caught the bladed instrument with his palm. Pain flared in his arm and he felt his reserves plummet, but his grip held fast, if only just. The ground. Dot was not so fortunate. John felt rather than saw the soil splinter underfoot, heard it part with an awful crack. Fine fissures spread out from the point of impact, threatening to sink his footing entirely. His knees buckled, he firmed them up again with a pulse of chakra, squared his shoulders, and stood tall, fingers biting into the bladed edge. Cracks scrawled across the steel. Blue eyes bled red, blazing with rare anger. He hadn't been hit this hard since one of Dad's spars. Even then, Naruto had restrained himself. But this. That, he rasped, wasn't very nice. Port's smile was all teeth. It was not a very nice smile. For a wild moment John wondered if the teacher would carry through and try to chop his head off. He certainly had the strength to do so. Imagine his surprise then, when the older man relented with a hearty guffaw. You pass. John's jaw clicked open. What? Dear boy, the lunatic slammed his axe into the dirt and wiped a mirthful tear from the corner of his eye. My apologies for the sudden ambush, but I had to be sure. Sure of what? John grit his teeth. Your lineage, of course. Something flashed in Port's gaze then, the eyes of a man whom Beacon thought to be little more than a senile old coot well past his prime. What else? I wasn't certain before, but now I am. Ha! He leaned closer, still grinning. After all these years. You're his son, aren't you? John's blood ran cold. His lips sealed shut. He daren't speak. There it is. Port reeled back. That's the look. Just like your father, after all. The man's grin was nothing short of gleeful. His eyes were open beneath that bushy brow of his, dark irises regarding him with undisguised glee. What fun. Tell me, how is that old fox doing? He refused to rise to the bait. Anything he said could be used against him. I don't know who you're talking about, sir. Not going to tell me, Port puffed himself up and shrugged. That's fair. Still, I do believe I told you to dodge, boy. Peace said. The man moved to stow his weapon on his back. Not catch my axe. A finger flicked his forehead. Do be more careful next time. I could have maimed you. And you didn't even strike back. A pudgy finger wagged at him. For shame. We'll need to cultivate that killer instinct of yours in the future. Wait. John looked left. John looked right. Not a soul in sight. Port had chosen his moment well. Did you want me to hit you? Port's smile had entirely too many teeth for his liking. Maybe next time, if you can. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. John's world began to whirl, bringing with it a faint sense of nausea deep in the pit of his stomach. There was going to be a next time. None of this made a lick of sense. Who was he? How did Professor Port, assuming that was his real name, know Dad? That shouldn't be possible. Ah, I've frightened you. Don't worry, boy. Port patted his head, tousling his hair with a large hand. His fingers were cold. Your secret is safe with me. A bushy brow quivered down at him as he winked. After all, it would be so very boring if you were outed from Beacon before he arrived, wouldn't you agree? Well, that's my piece said. With another guffaw the jolly round fellow waltzed away, a spring in his step. Do give Naruto my regards when you see him next. A dark eye winked over his shoulder. From one faker to another, tell him I said hello. And one last thing, a fat finger rose, just so we're perfectly clear on where we stand. He paused, pivoting to face him full. There it was again, the hint of that smile that bordered on sadism. Do not bore me, John. You wouldn't like me when I'm bored. An invisible pressure came with those words, slamming down on his shoulders like lightning itself. It wasn't Dad. But it felt like him. That same ominous intent, that sheer sense of presence when he got serious, this was worse. Colder. Sterner. Mania masked behind a merry facade cultivated over decades. Wait. Against his better judgment he called out to him. Who are you, really? The man pivoted on one heel, marched away, and didn't look back. Why, Port, of course. Who else would I be? Was it the truth? A lie? Some mad blend of the two? He wasn't sure, there was a part of him that didn't want to know. Instead he held his tongue as his teacher trundled away, whistling a merry as he was. John didn't dare move, not until port was well out of sight. Right. The reality of his situation hit him a moment later. Panic took wing in his heart and kicked up a vicious. Frantic, he turned to the one person he trusted more than any chance you recognize that lunatic. Kurama creaked an eye open. John, my attention is divided between you, your father, your mother, and your siblings. A deadpan silence followed from his uncle. I've been watching out for you lot from the moment Saffron came into this world. Do you have any idea how many diapers I helped change? How many scraped knees I healed? How many hands I held? Scraped knees. Hands. Wait, you have a human form. Not the point. So is that a no? I don't know. He seems familiar, but for the life of me, I can't place him. Please don't tell Dad about this. Kurama didn't answer. That itself was answer enough. John heaved a sigh, shoulders slumping. Well, he certainly had problems of his own now. He could only hope that child was behaving herself, wherever she was. Who was he kidding? Knowing her, she'd probably raised half a veil to the ground by now. 0.0.0.0. Child jolted as her scroll rang. She picked it up at once. Hello, Daddy. 0.0.0.0. Sue. How did it go? Coco cornered Velvet far too quickly for her liking. In other words, her partner hunted her down like a stag. To be perfectly fair, she managed to avoid her leader for a time, but on a field trip like this, it simply wasn't feasible to evade her forever. Never mind the very real possibility of grim cropping, but they had rookies to look after. If they strayed too far, or gods forbid, something happened to one of them, Goodwitch would have their hides. Nothing would happen to John, though. He could probably bench press a Beowulf, among other things. Things like her meep. Bad brain. It went. She shook her head and refused to look at her fellow brunette, if only because she knew she'd find a shit-eating grin there. Weiss, aren't you supposed to be looking after Team CRDL? Really? Those pricks. Coco lowered her glasses with one finger to reveal narrow eyes. Why would I have any interest in their safety? They can go get eaten by an Ursa for all I care. Surely she wouldn't. No, this was Coco, after all. Velvet made angry velvet noises. You can't just leave them to die because they bullied me. The gunner planted a fist on her hip. Can and will, bun. Velvet flailed at her chest. Coco. Relax, I'm joking. A peal of delighted laughter greeted her as she fended her off with one hand. What's the worst those meatheads could do on their own? She caught one palm, twisted it down, and flicked her forehead with a gurn. But enough about Cardin. She leaned in, grinning like the huntress she would soon be. I'd much rather talk about Mr. Tall, blonde, and handsome. You give him the goods, yeah. Oh gods, her ears were burning again. She tugged one down to hide her face. Maybe. Velvet. I did, alright. Her cheeks flamed with heat. And, now it was Coco's turn to flail at her. Details, girl. I need them. Velvet gave them up begrudgingly, if only because she knew better than to deny her team leader. If she didn't tell her, Coco would just hunt down poor John and grill him until he cracked. Not that. Anything but that. Her grin almost made her think it would have been worth it. Coco went terribly still. And then you kissed him. Yes, no. She course-corrected with a yelp, realizing her mistake. No kissing. None of that. There was no kissing. Coco's grin had been smug before, now it was nothing short predatory. A moment of silence passed between them. And then. Damn girl, you're thirsty. Velvet sputtered. Coco. 0.0.0.0. John trudged back to his team, feeling every bit a dead man. He felt even more like one when his scroll vibrated. Seemed the universe had it out for him today. Naturally his first instinct was to ignore it, as he'd done countless times before. The second was to wonder how in the hells he had reception way out here. Technically Vale's CCT towers allowed cell-based communication across Remnant. But this far from the city there shouldn't be a signal at all, certainly not a strong one. Answer it. Kurama's voice was strangely soft for once. Might help. He ripped it from his pocket and gave it a baleful glance. Maybe, Maybe some advice was what he needed right about now. Or comfort. Maybe a bit of both. Taking a deep breath, he tried to keep a warble of distress out of his voice. Mom. He gulped, I think I need some advice, don't tell Dad. Oh, sure. A low voice drawled in his ear, brimming with sarcasm. Now my wayward son asks for advice. Nope. Not Mom. Not her at all. This was it. His life was over. He was doomed. Dad. But this is Mom's number. How did you even? Uncle Pietro, of course Tilda. John balked, how many people do you know? Now. The grainy voice came through. Your mother's the only one for me, but that doesn't mean I couldn't make a few friends. Speaking of which, the pause that followed proved heavy indeed. Why don't you make this easier on yourself and tell me where you are? You're not in Atlas, and you're not in Vacuo. That means Mistral or Vale. Which is it, John? Where are you? His already cold blood became solid ice in his veins. On a certain level he knew his father was being generous, kind to him, even. If Naruto truly wanted to hunt him down, he would have done so by now. No stone would be left unturned. Instead he'd given him a chance. He'd delayed, stalled, or perhaps events had conspired to capture his attention. If it came to a fight, he would lose. No doubt about that. There was even a chance he might be tracing this call. You know I can't tell you that, Dad. No. I'll just ask your sister, then. Where did that darling girl run off to? John clammed up. I don't know what you're talking about. All right. His voice remained gentle on the other end of the line. At least answer me this, then. Which one are you interested in? The blonde, the brunette, the redhead, or maybe? Aha, so Child had welched on him after all. Not where he was, but who had taken an interest in him. There would be vengeance for this. I'm hanging up now. Wait. The sudden plea caught his thumb just before he could end the call. Earlier, you said you needed advice. What for? John wanted to tell him, more than anything. Even now, ever after all this, here was a small boyish part of him wanted to tell Dad everything, to let him swoop in and fix things as he always had in the past. Whenever trouble reared its ugly head, he'd always hid behind him or Mom, or his sisters. He always had. He gripped his scroll until it creaked in his grasp. Just some teacher troubles. That's all. John Ark. Tell me you didn't fake your way into becoming a professor. A surprised laugh escaped him. I didn't. Just the thought of it threatened to unman him. Professor Ark, really? Not a chance. His forgery credentials were good, but not that good. He didn't have half the credentials needed for a position like that. He could barely pretend to be a student. The brief moment of levity helped center him regardless. What had Dad said to him once? All you need is a little confidence. Right. He said at last. I can handle this. Hearing your voice helped. John. The pause made him wince. If you're in danger, you'll let me know, won't you? I'm not in danger. It wasn't a lie. Not really. Just give me a little more time. Please. I'm begging you. You have until I track you down and drag you back by the ear. It was the best he'd get. And not a single day more, young man. Your sisters are worried sick. For him, Saffron he could understand, but he couldn't imagine Valen and the rest being worried about anything. Had something happened? He nearly asked, but some sixth sense told him not to. Mom wielded guilt like an axe, but Dad could talk circles around someone. He wasn't about to fall prey to his father's infamous talk no jutsu. No openings here. No sir. Your mother's worried, too. We all are. Come home, John. All right, maybe one opening. Dad, no. He grit his teeth, mastering a sudden surge of sorrow. I'm not going back. I can't. Then you'll need to prove you're strong enough to stay. He shivered. I will. I'll prove it. A pause. You'll lose. We'll see. Neither spoke for a long moment. Naruto sighed into the silence. Love you, kiddo. He'd slapped John's face. He sputtered. Dodd. Though the line went dead on his father's laughter. Strangely enough, it lifted his spirits. John took a deep breath, and exhaled. His fear began to bleed away with it. Dad was right. He had absolutely no hope of defeating him on his own. But then again, whoever said he had to do it alone? The spark of an idea struck, burning bright. Ninja never played fair, after all. It began to gutter out as he considered the sheer enormity of the task before him. That's all well and good, but how can I beat him? Even with backup, he's way too strong. He'd need help, a lot of help if he even wanted to scratch Dad. Never mind beat him back. It was too much. He couldn't. Hey, John. A sudden tug against his sleeve stilled him. For a moment he thought it was Velvet, come back to ask him a question. Not now. Anytime but now. He looked down. Blinked. Frowned. Pretty sure Velvet didn't have silver eyes. You're looking pretty down, there. Ruby Rose looked back up, her eyes wide and concerned. Are you alright? Ordinarily he would have said yes, fobbed her off with an excuse or something. But she looked so small. So pitiful. So concerned. And he wasn't alright. Not by a long shot. It felt like the whole of Remnant had crashing down around his shoulders. The burden alone threatened to crush him. I messed up. The words burst out of him before he could think to hold them back. My sister's got me on a leash, my dad's looking for me, and now this. Silver eyes fluttered in a quick blink. You have a sister. Not important. He palmed his face with a groan. I'm starting to think coming to this school was a bad idea. I'm a failure. Nope. He paused. No. Nope. She shook her head and retreated half a step, clasping both hands behind her back. ... I don't understand. Means no. The faintest hint of a smile lifted her pale cheeks. You're a leader now, John. You're not allowed to be a failure. John felt his right eye twitch. Her words didn't soothe him. If anything, they made him angry. Easy for her to say. She'd ironed things out with Weiss in less than a day. Her team loved her. They'd probably go to the ends of Remnant and back for her. He was still struggling to be one, and juggling his old life with the new. But what if I'm a failure at being a leader? Nope. Came the happy chirrup. Again with that, he planted his back against a tree and slid down it, dropping to his haunches. You know, you're not the easiest person to talk to about this kind of stuff. Imagine his surprise then, when she plonked down beside him. John, maybe you were a failure as a kid. His already wounded ego crumpled even further. Great pep talk, Ruby. I feel so much better. You might have even been a failure the first day we met. Hey. But you can't be one now. She reached over and swatted his hand, startling him. Because it's not just about you anymore. You've got a team now, John. We both do. She looked away and his gaze followed. It fell upon Pyrrha and the others, blissfully gathering sap, ignorant to their worries. And if we fail, then we'll just bring them down with us. We have to put our teammates first, and ourselves second. Not tryin' to fail. He muttered morosely into his arms. I just don't know where to start. Ruby didn't answer at first and he began to fear she'd given up on him. You already have. John's head shot up. Excuse you. I said you already have. Earnest silver eyes met his, glowing with fervor. You don't even realize half of the things you've done. There was no escape. He leaned back and Ruby pushed forward, nearly falling into his lap to get at him. Not just for me, or even that velvet girl, but Weiss, too. His eyes watered. Ruby. Your team deserves a great leader, John. She climbed to her feet and offered him her hand. And I know that can be you. You just have to try. No matter what Weiss does. What was that last bit about Weiss? Vengeance will be mine. He heard a battle cry in the distance, followed by the death gurgle of a Beowulf. Ruby waved a hand. Weiss is Weiss. You get used to it. That same hand swung back, all but squashing against his face. What I'm saying is, you can be a good leader. We both can. You just need a little confidence, and, stuff. She flashed a timid smile at him as her nerves failed her. Practice makes perfect, after all. It was too much. John broke down. Not into tears, but laughter, a great, hearty guffaw tore out of him, leaving him bent double. Everything sounded so simple when she put it like that. Ruby misunderstood, of course. She huffed and puffed out her cheeks in anger. It only made him laugh all the harder. Just a little confidence. How often Dad threw that very saying at him. Now here he was, hearing it again. Was it really that simple? Just a little confidence, He reached up, took her hand, and pushed himself upright. Then he struck. RWBY never saw him coming. One moment he stood before her, the next his arms drew her into a crushing embrace. Her head slammed into his chest as she made a noise of protest, muffled against his jacket. John. Thank you. He muttered over her shoulder, heedless of her complaints. Thank you so damn much. His arms tightened around her as he bent down and buried his face into her hoodie. It gave him time to blink the tears away when they threatened to overwhelm him. You have no idea how badly I needed to hear that. You're a great friend. Right, friend, glad I could help. She stammered out, arms flailing. Totally what I meant to say, and wow, you really area one-man furnace. Oh ho. Yang's voice called across the clearing. What do we have here, sister of mine? RWBY jerked back as if she'd been burned. Yang. It's not what it looks like. No. Her sister sauntered over. 'Cause it looks like you were enjoying yourself. John tried not to laugh at her plight. He really did. He failed spectacularly. But maybe that was all right. Everyone failed now and again. This was his life, now. He would fight to keep it. John bit back a smile as he levered the shield of Crocia Morse before his face and took a ready stance. Not a moment too soon. Scarce had he raised his trusty bulwark than a powerful fist slammed into him. The impact alone rattled his arm and sent him sliding backwards. His shoes stomped down against the mat, aura sparking, chakra flaring, to stick him in place and prevent an ignoble defeat. Grunting but a little, he wrested himself away from the edge and stalked back in. Too close. She'd nearly knocked him clear out the ring that time. Still, you fight good. He couldn't even bring himself to be angry after taking that hit. It was such a Yang thing to say that he had to laugh. Shaking the ache out of his arm, he considered the blonde brawler for a moment. Green aura for both of them, neither anywhere in yellow. But this wasn't working. He'd been on the back foot since they'd begun. Swordplay was all well and good, but against someone like Yang Xiaolong, it wasn't enough. Time to fall back on his tried and true talents. John, no. Kurama growled. Don't even think about it. John, yes. Blast it all, normal or not, he'd been on the defensive for too long. I can barely move like this. Really love your puns, don't ya? Sheathing his sword before him, he reached down and began to fiddle not with his crimson chestplate, gauntlets or greaves, but rather what lay beneath them. You've been at it for the last 5 minutes, you know. Yang arched an eyebrow, but didn't budge. What can I say? He heard the telltale crack of Ember Celica reloading as she cocked her fists. I like what I like. The ghost of a smile touched whiskered cheeks. Then you're gonna love this. Gimme a second, will you? Never once to balk at a challenge, she stood her ground. Alright. I'll bite. Not gonna use your sword. He cast Crocia Morse down. I'll let my fists do the talking. Nora hooted from the sideline. Thata boy, Johnny. Kick some blonde butt. Hey. I'm blonde. Meh. She waved a hand. Potato. Not a week after Forever Fall in Combat class had round come once again, dragging him back into the spotlight. After that wild waltz with Weiss, he'd almost dared to hope he'd proven himself capable enough for a while longer. He'd almost throw himself safe in the peaceful glow of anonymity. Not so, apparently. What Miss Goodwitch wanted, Goodwitch got. Well, at least he wasn't facing RWBY. He didn't think he could bear to hurt her. She reminded him too much of his sisters. Good, pure, always ready with a smile and kind word, ever eager to help. Moreover, he was fairly certain RWBY wouldn't be able to take what was coming Yang's way. There. He found the clasp beneath his gauntlets. Something heavy struck the ground. It wasn't his armor. Yang made a puzzled noise, but he didn't stop. Next came the one wrapped around his chest beneath his armor. A quick tap and the final strap went with it, followed the weight beneath his greaves. One by one they crashed down against the mat, allowing him ease of movement once more. He rolled his shoulders and bounced upon one heel, then the other, testing himself. He was quite pleased with what he found. Much better. He'd been wearing those blasted things for the last year, his body felt so much lighter without them. A light, lilting laugh trickled into the air. It took John a moment to realize it came from him. Pyrrha hummed from the sidelines. Oh dear, those looked heavy. She had no idea. Chakra weights weren't something you wanted to mess about with. Yang balked back, eyeing the small pile unlimbered at their feet. You were wearing weights under your armor. This entire time. Weiss uttered a strangled sound behind him, drawing a wince from John. Oh. Right. He'd fought her with those on, hadn't he? Couldn't remember. It felt like he had. You really have no idea, do you? John shrugged helplessly. Nope. Weiss made angry Weiss noises anew. Ballsy. Yang pumped a fist and started forward. I like it. RWBY squawked at his back. Hey. That's my line. Dirty line stealer. He craned his neck toward her. I'll buy you a plate of cookies after class. It was like flipping a switch. Her squawk became a squeal of joy. And you're forgiven. Yang's shout behind was his only warning. Heads up. John dodged by a hair's breadth, narrowly avoided a fist that would have launched him clear out the ring, and lashed out in kind. She was all too happy to meet him head on. Clenched knuckles collided. Aura sparked as air burst between them. Cheery lilac eyes blazed back at him. They almost seemed to burn. Red. What was that? A semblance or something. She swung with her other fist, and when he reciprocated, said fist opened, fingers grasping. Quite suddenly he found himself holding hands with her, grappling against this gregarious, grinning girl. His brain bleated in dismay. Isn't this a little forward? That's much better, she all but purred the words. I can actually feel that. John felt something, too. Embarrassment. He'd never held hands with a girl before. Eye on the ball, tiger. Much to his chagrin, she tried to push forward and failed. Her smug smile vanished as quickly as it came. John's didn't waver. This wasn't something he could fake. If he let Yang overpower him, she'd surely notice. That would lead to questions he wasn't ready to answer. So he planted his feet, grit his teeth, and took one step. 2. 3. Slowly, inexorably, he pushed Yang back. Back yet again, towards the ring. Credit where it was due, she caught on quickly. Ah, hell. Her lips pursed in a scowl. Weiss didn't say you were this strong. I'm sorry. He winced a little. Time for you to lose. Yang was strong. Really, she was. He was just stronger than her. She must have realized it too, because she broke the grapple and swept his legs. The world twisted and he had all of an instant to see Ember Celica whistling toward his face. Say what you would about Yang, but she wasn't stupid. She had a temper that burned white hot when you tugged on her hair, as he'd learned after that last combo, but anger didn't necessarily make her a berserker. She was an entirely different beast than Weiss, stubborn as only a fellow blonde could be. Damneatle, that made him want to fight her fair and square. Slapping a hand on the mat, he caught himself, pivoted his hips, and smashed a bruising kick into her side. He felt her ribs creak before she hit the mat. Yang didn't stumble so much as she dropped to a knee, even so it gave him time enough to scramble upright. She grit her teeth and surged after him with a roar. He found himself returning it as he lunged at her. His fist slammed into her cheek. An uppercut smashed into his chest, rattling his armor. He caught her by the arm and reeled her into a bruising knee. They spun away and came back for more. Ha! He heard her cry. That's more like it. Where have you been hiding? Time got funny after that, seconds blurring into minutes as they fought on. Strike after strike, combo after combo, a blazing burly brawl that saw them raging across the ring. Hoots and hollers of encouragement chased them as they fought. Had he been aware of them, he might have blushed. Fight well. Go John. Kick her butt. Save some of him for me, Xiao Long. All eyes turned to Weiss. What? She shrugged. At least I'm honest about it. He heard none of it, only the roar in his ears, the sweat on his skin, the smile stretching his face. He could feel his right eye aching, a black eye forming, but he didn't care. Wading in, ducked a kick, caught Yang by her thigh and flung her away. She twisted in the air and unloaded on him, Ember Celica raining dust around him. He crossed his arms and trusted in his armor, only for her to come raging through the smoke and force him on the defensive once more. Someday, son. He recalled Dad's words in an instant. Someday you'll meet someone who gives as good as they get. Watch out for people like that. They just won't go down. Dad had been right. This was what he lived for. Give him a good fight any day of the week. He was pants when it came to homework. Gee, it's almost like you needed to learn those things before you came to Beacon. Not helping. John gave as good as he got, wailing on her with nearly no restraint. Yang returned it in kind. Her grin had returned. He wasn't sure why. Her aura was falling, and fast. Any moment now Miss Goodwitch would step in. If she didn't, one of them, likely Yang, was going to drop, and soon. Finally, he caught Yang's chin with a rousing uppercut. It was a good punch, stern and solid, more than enough to knock her out. Yang's head snapped back, then snapped down thrice as fast. Too late, John saw her eyes. They were red. Like fire. She grinned at him. Now that's a punch. My turn. Too close. Too fast. No, he could tank it. Clenched knuckles dented his cheek. Her punch sent him flying. John didn't even realize he'd landed out of the ring. He must have blacked out one moment he was standing, the next, Yang Xiaolong stood over him, hand extended before his blurry vision. Why were there three of her? Had she really hit him that hard? Chagrin broke through the haze. Sloppy. He'd been arrogant, tanking a hit he should have, by all rights, dodged. Dad would have had his hide. OT bad. John dug a finger into his ringing ear, to no avail. I said not bad. Yang's grin was nothing short of contagious. You almost had me there. Kurama scoffed. Bah. You would have won if you hadn't limited yourself. This is what you get for holding back. His spirits soared as she hauled him to his feet. Worth it, though. Ain't your fault. Yang must have mistook the words for herself, because she preened like the phoenix she was. You fought me on my terms, not yours. She flicked her golden mane over one shoulder. For what's its worth, that last hit was my semblance. Lets me dish out the damage I take twice as hard. You'll be ready for it next time. A thought must have occurred to her then, because she absolutely grinned at him. Guess I beat you to the pun NNCH for once. Silence stretched between the two of them. That was bad and you should feel bad. John twitched. Ow, my head. Not bad, Tiger. She clapped his shoulder. Maybe I'll start calling you that, instead. Another nickname in the Xiaolong repertoire. Lovely. As if she needed another. Please, don't. Too late. See you around, Tiger. Her piece said. The bemused brawler drawled the last word, bumped her hip against his and walked strutted, away to face the praise of her team. John slumped a little as his own came to console him, rubbing his aching eye. Right. Lesson learned. Don't tank what you can dodge. Realization dawned soon thereafter. Wait a minute. He'd lost a match. A bleary grin spread across whiskered cheeks. Cover secure. 0.0.0.0. This mission will be dangerous. Knowing this, will you still accept it, Penny? The cheery girl snapped off a sharp salute. Yes sir, grandfather. Naruto patted her head. Good girl. 0.0.0.0. Blake was wary of John Arc. It wasn't caution born of confrontation, rather, a lack thereof. The boy was a walking enigma, one she couldn't seem to puzzle out no matter how hard she tried. Therein lie the problem. She liked mysteries. Less so when they endangered her perhaps, but they intrigued her all the same. And yet he'd not made the slightest effort to approach her. Not in the least. They'd barely spoken to one another. Two acquaintances, two ships passing in the night, their teams aware of one another but little else. He had performed well against Weiss and earned a bit of favor from that, if only because a small secret part of her had enjoyed watching the Schnee get smacked around. Was it wrong? Definitely. Did she enjoy it? Maybe a little. He was a faunus too, he must be. No ordinary human would have whiskers like that on their face. Today's bout only baffled Blake further. He wasn't all powerful. Yang had managed to beat him, hadn't she? He'd pulled back at the last second. He must have. Yang might have missed it, but she hadn't. As if he'd stopped himself from dealing a lethal blow. Only a killer could see such things. Though it shamed her to admit it. On the outside he'd put up a brave front, kind and affable, ever ready to step up when someone was in need. The very ideal of a huntsman. He'd certainly shown Winchester a thing or two. Yang and RWBY seemed to get on with him well enough. Weiss probably wanted a rematch with him. But she saw the way he held himself, the way he moved, the manner in which he held himself, the hesitation at key moments. Unfortunately that begged another, more personal question. Did he know? She was hardly as infamous as Adam, but hadn't been subtle during her time with the White Fang, or her disguise. Most Faunus knew her face, if not her last name. In hindsight, that might have been her fault. A bow. Really. She could have changed her name and outfit, dyed her hair, wore colored contacts, even thrown Gamble Shroud away. Instead she'd hidden her ears behind a pretty bit of ribbon and called it a day. Because surely no one could see through such a brilliant disguise. Not one of her finer moments, that. Paranoid kitty is being paranoid, a tiny voice her own self-doubts cooed in her ear. He doesn't even know who you are. Nonsense. It isn't paranoia if someone's out to get me. Exactly the sort of thing a paranoid person would say. She was talking to herself again. Tossing her head from side to side, she buried herself in her book. Or rather, she tried. A frustrated groan drew her back to reality. The sight before her did much to diminish the mystery of John Arc in her eyes, for the object of her curiosity sat not a table away. He was trying too hard. I can't figure this out. Head in his hands, teeth bared, eyes wild, he looked fit to bite the textbook before him. For that at least she wouldn't blame him. Professor Port's nonsensical assignments were a cakewalk compared to the sheer slew of paperwork that was Professor Oobleck's. Someone in the distance Blake could have sworn she heard the man holler, "Doctor!" at the skies. Her imagination, surely. Still, how could someone with strength and committed be so hopelessly incompetent when it came to homework? Sat before an empty table in the library, locked in mortal combat with an equation he couldn't comprehend, John Arc fought. It was a losing battle. He agonized over the text to no avail. He was trying to do it alone too, the stubborn boy. But why? What did he gain from such a thing? Did he not want to disgrace himself before his team? Or was he simply studying during his downtime? More questions, not enough answers. Being a hunter is hard. His lips pursed, unaware of her keen hearing. Yeah, no, I chose this, but math is evil. Blake felt her ears twitch beneath her bow. Who was he talking to? Himself. It seemed the obvious answer, and yet she didn't want to give it. For a Faunus, he didn't let anything get to him, yet an up-and-coming test had him racking his brain and chewing on a nail, gritting his teeth as though he were caught in some life-and-death struggle. Enough. Blake took pity on him. It's simple. Her arm crossed his as she reached over him and scribbled out the rest of the formula. See. She nudged his arm when he titled his head. You just solve for X here. Then the root follows through. It's basic. How do you not know this? Sure, basic. Guess I must have missed that class. He blinked, then grinned. It didn't reach his eyes. You know, you're a pretty nice person, Blake. Are right. She gulped. Nice. Paraonia reared its ugly head anew. Was he onto her? By the way, he continued, wholly unaware of her mounting anxiety, I wanted to ask you something. Panic bleated, turning her thoughts to static. Ask her about what? The White Fang. Nope. Code red. Abandoned ship. Blake stepped back sharply, not quick enough to miss the flash of confusion on his face, followed by hurt. Wait. He rose, reaching out in a vain attempt to stop her. It wasn't anything bad, I swear. She retreated, or rather, tried to, because she smacked into someone. I'm sorry, she mumbled to them, please excuse me. Another John blocked her path. Another John. Blake recoiled. What is this? I'm sorry. Each John flailed their arms, looking quite chagrined. I panicked. As she looked on aghast, the doppelganger vanished in a plume of smoke. Please don't tell anyone. Her mind whirled a mile a minute. Don't tell anyone. Did he have a secret too? No, not important. That, just now, what was that? He'd created another physical copy of himself, not at all like her clones. It had caught her, stopped her, and not dissolved. It had even spoken to her. Clones didn't do that. That thing had been alive. Golden eyes fluttered in a rapid blink. Just what are you? John scratched the back of his head. Just a normal student. Naruto loved his family. Loved them more than life he did, to the point he'd gladly give his own for them in a heartbeat. Some might say that much was obvious, but it felt it needed saying all the same. Of course, he loved them. Just as he loved his wife. Juniper Arc was an absolute marvel with the patience of a saint. How else could she help him rear so many child, much less discipline them? She wasn't afraid to mete out the more inventive punishments when his will faltered. Truly, he didn't deserve her. In some of his darker moments he wondered what his life would have been like without her. Without this gaggle of blondes. Naruto didn't like to dwell on those moments. For better or worse she'd chosen him, and he, her. As things stood now, he couldn't imagine a life without his family. Not without his June, not without their daughters, and certainly now without John. Stubborn son or no, the boy was still family. Nothing could change that. Even if he'd run away. Even if he'd gone astray. Even if he had to drag his silly son back the ear, kicking and screaming. Which led him to his current, shall we say, predicament. Blue eyes drifted to the bottle atop the table. He really shouldn't. Screw it. Naruto snapped the cap, knocked it back, and took a long drink. Guzzled it all, to the last drop. It burned all the way down, but the searing pain helped to settle his ragged nerves. He glared through the green glass with a sigh and scowled at the warped reflection within. The face within the bottle looked tired. Naturally. It was his own. He reached for his scroll. A single line of text still awaited him on the screen within, face up against the table. I have found John, grandfather. Would you like me to bring him back? Penny had come through quickly. He almost wished she hadn't. Beacon. John was in Beacon. Of all the places he didn't want him to be. It made a twisted sort of sense of course. Ozpin's academy was the closet after all, and John had never been fond of vacuo. Did he have any idea of the danger he'd landed himself in? No, of course not. He didn't know. How could John be aware, when his own mother and father had spent their lives keeping him in the dark? If this was karma for his past misdeeds, Kurama would surely laugh at him. You there? The old fox still refused to answer. Damn it. Of all the times for them to have a falling out. He had to answer. His thumb paused, then keyed in a quick message. Keep an eye on him, but don't interfere. I'm on my way. Firm hands planted themselves on either side of the table, levering his body upright. He took a deep breath to steady himself, both in heart and for what was to come. He could make it to Beacon in less than 9 minutes if he ran full tilt. John would never see him coming. He'd be angry of course, but he'd understand someday. This was for the best. He wasn't ready. The door to the kitchen creaked open behind him. Sir. Do you have a moment? Naruto bit down on a growl. He knew who it was, of course. Her timing simply left much to be desired. Still, now seemed as good a time as any. Best to clear things up before all hell broke loose. He'd been meaning to have a stern word with her and Saffron for some time now, but he simply hadn't a chance. Plastering a smile to his face, he pivoted to face her and gestured to the chair opposite him. Pyrrha. Please, have a seat. I've been meaning to have a word with you about Saffron. Pyrrha was a skittish little thing. She clearly wanted to make a good impression on him for Saffron's sake, but in the same vein she clearly didn't know how. She tried to act confident and for the most part she was. It just withered away whenever they were in the same room together. That she'd come to him and sat down without flinching, well. He'd give her points for that. Less so for her watching him like a hawk, but still. You can stop staring. He sighed into the stifling silence that followed. Ain't gonna bite. She snapped off a salute. Yes sir. Naruto quirked a brow. None of that. You'll make me feel old. Sorry. The dark-skinned girl grimaced and glared at her right hand as if it had betrayed her. Old habits. Were you in the military? No, she shook her head. But my father was. Color him surprised. Army brat. That explained a few things. Fair. You've told me about yourself already. I'd like to ask your intentions toward my daughter. Pyrrha squeaked and looked down into her lap, glasses hiding her eyes. Naruto sighed anew. By the log, he was too tired for this. He'd tried to shard to keep his family secret from the world, and for the most he'd succeeded. But now this. There was a small part of him that wanted to erase Pyrrha's memories and be done with it. He was a dab hand at genjutsu these days, could even make her think this was all one big dream if he really wanted to. Saffron would never forgive him for such an act of course, it was the only thing stopping him. Unfortunately for Pyrrha, it only intensified his scrutiny. Juniper wasn't here to swoop in and save her this time, she'd taken the girls out for groceries. And yet despite knowing this, Tara had come to him. I love her. She burst out suddenly, face gone rose. I wanna marry her. Her hands slapped down on the table, startling him. Hell, I want her babies. One could have heard a needle drop in the silence that followed. Naruto could have sworn he heard Juniper's joyous shriek all the way from town. Grandbabies. Still, he blinked. He blinked hard. Is that so? Genetics aside, you do realize my girl could snap you in half if the two of you ever tried. Words failed him. Tara wrung her hands in her lap and made a noise akin to steam escaping a tea kettle. Naruto's brow climbed higher. Oh ho. So that's how it is. Forward little thing, aren't you? She looked down again. Please don't ask the particulars. Not a chance in hell. Geez, you Atlas types, I swear. Bold and brash as ever. Fine. Far be it from me to pry into something like that. He waved a hand and pivoted to lean against the counter, back to the sink. Saffron's clearly fond of you and you've not lied to me thus far, so let me be clear. Break her heart and I feed you yours. If you reveal the existence of this place, this family, to anyone and I mean anyone at all, without my express permission, I'll wipe your mind and turn you to a drooling wreck. Do we have an understanding? The fire in her eyes pleased him to no end. I'd die before I betrayed her. She would, too. Her feelings ran true. More points for her. Blast him for being such a softie. He wouldn't wipe her mind after all. Doing so would not only deprive Saffron of her dear heart, it might break her completely. Besides, he was actually curious to see what they'd be like as parents. Life often found a way after all, and Saffron was nothing if not persistent. Wasn't there a jutsu that let you transfer your essence into someone? He wasn't sure. It had been a long while since he'd gone through the old compendium. If such a technique existed, surely his eldest daughter would turn it to her advantage. Do you know how to fight? She lifted her chin. I have some remedial training. Aura and semblance unlocked. Another nod. Good. He granted her a grin. I'll have to see what you're capable of, but for now, you pass. He heard Tara's heart skip a beat in her chest. Sir. A cup winged off her aura. Stop calling me that. Pink hit her cheeks. Then. Dad. Naruto's own heart kicked against his chest. Don't push your luck. His sixth sense twitched again. Right, he'd almost forgotten about their little eavesdropper. He craned his neck back to the kitchen door, or rather, the presence he felt lurking behind it for the last minute. Of course she'd noticed. He would have been disappointed if she hadn't. You can stop hiding now. I'm not going to kill her. The frame fell inward, revealing a flustered Saffron. Tara squeaked anew. Which brings us to the next matter. He turned his body to face his eldest fully as she clambered to her feet. You're going to help me track down your brother. Saffron went still as stone for an altogether different reason. You know where he is. I do. He felt a host of emotions race through her as he spoke. So do you. She squirmed under his gaze. I didn't do anything wrong. Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose. If you hadn't helped John run away, none of this would have happened in the first place. She huffed. It's his life to live, Dad. He's stronger than you think. Not strong enough. She quirked a brow and planted both hands on her hips. Gods, stubborn as her mother. Not like me. You're damn near indestructible. He laid a hand on your shoulder. The same can't be said for your brother. You're going to drag him back and lock him in Ansel, aren't you? I am. No point in saying otherwise. What of it? Saffron glanced to Tara. And if I refuse? Then you're grounded. Her eyes flashed. I'll tell Mom. Go right ahead. He waved her on. She'll say the same HTING. He saw the heat rise in her eyes. She's an angel compared to you when you get like this. Angel. A bemused bark of laughter leapt from his lips. You think your mother's an angel. She's not even close to an angel. She's death itself if you piss her off. So, when I say grounded, you are grounded, Missy. Saffron tossed her head. No. I won't let you do this. You can try to fight, if you like. He gave a small shrug. It's all one and the same to me. It'll end with you in timeout, just like last time. Tara tried to stand behind him, reaching for something in her belt. Naruto flicked a glance her way. Sit. This doesn't concern you. His will hit hers, and her mind yielded. The girl crashed back into her seat. You shouldn't have done that. Saffron's brow drew down and he glimpsed a hint of that old Uzumaki arc stubbornness in her eyes. My powers have doubled since the last time we fought. Good. Naruto felt an old, familiar smile pluck at the corner of his mouth. He could use a little light exercise. Twice the pride, double the fall. Her eyes went red, the telltale slits of her Kurama's chakra bleeding through alongside her heat vision. You really don't wanna do this, old man. I'll hurt you. What's this? He spread his arms wide as the air brightened around him. Little Saffron thinks she's all grown up. Doesn't need daddy anymore, Well, come on then. A clawed hand crooked her way. Time to leave the nest. Here's the deal. I want you to hit me as hard as you can. She growled. Don't tempt me. Now hold on. He held up a hand to forestall her protest. Not half as hard, not some arbitrary percentage. With one hand he reached up and tore off his coat, exposing the tight orange shirt beneath. I want you to hit me as hard as you can. Saffron grit her teeth. And if I won't? Then I guess you're not strong enough to protect Pyrrha. Stars. Whole galaxies flashed before Naruto's vision, his head snapped to the right, neck creaking pleasantly. His gaze shifted a little and belatedly he realized Saffron had smashed her heel into the side of his head. A tiny grin touched his lips. She'd gone for a knockout blow, just like he'd taught her. It wasn't enough. Consider that nerve touched. He caught her by the ankle before she could draw back. But we both know that wasn't your best. Planting his feet, he whirled and whipped her through a wall. Timber and plastered cratered, leaving a decidedly human-shaped impression behind. With but a thought, he flickered after her and retaliated with a kick of his own, catching her in the ribs. She hurtled up into sunny blue sky with a yelp, pierced a cloud, and kept going. Distantly, he heard Pyrrha clamor outside. What did you do? Naruto quirked a brow. Didn't I tell you to sit? She glared at him. Relax, she'll be fine. He touched a hand to his brow, shading his eyes. She just broke the atmosphere. Good thing I taught her to hold her breath. Oh. Here we go. Sure enough, a distant red light bloomed in the sky. Pyrrha whimpered. Oh, no. Hold that thought. Naruto's palm rose. Saffron's fist fell like a falling star. With a ponderous groan, the earth cratered underfoot as father and daughter grappled with one another. A subtle earth jutsu on the formers contained the shockwave and prevented it from decimating the yard as well as the house behind hit. Pyrrha stumbled back and landed hard on her rear, eyes bulging. Naruto quelled a tiny pang of guilt as he beheld the terror in her eyes. Poor girl. He'd frightened her. He would have preferred not to expose her to something like this. Oh, well. Making the mother of all omelets here. Can't fret over every egg. If he had to play the bad guy every now and again to make his kids strong, then so be it. The difference here was that Saffron stood strong and rose to the challenge. John. Had not. He had more potential, true, but he held himself back with his grand notions of heroism and honor and normalcy. Normal. They would never be normal. Saffron would happily fight and kill, to keep what was hers. However, a frustrated growl reminded him of his eldest, even now straining against him. Better, he slammed a knee into his daughter's stomach, blasting the breath from her lungs. But still not good enough. That's 2 strikes, now. She wheezed and folded over his leg. Naruto gripped her by the face, reared back, and smashed his forehead crashed into hers. The impact sent her sprawling in the dirt. See, sweetie. He called after her. That's what you get for not listening. But since I know you have trouble following directions, I'm gonna give you one last chance. A moment's pause now, scarcely enough for her to get up again. You. Me. Hard as you can. She muttered something incomprehensible, to which he quirked a brow. Are we clear? Saffron raised her gaze, golden hair fallen over one eye, the other steaming with rage. Crystal. With but a single word the temperature rose, spiking furiously. Wild eyes swept past him with singular intent. Pyrrha. The poor girl squeaked. Yes, dear. Behind me. Now. Pyrrha got. Golden light burst from Saffron's body as her intended took shelter behind her back. Black lines trailed the length of her slender figure as she called upon the entirety of her strength. Motes of dappled saffron on scarlet built in an outstretched palm, growing larger with each passing second. When she thrust the other hand forward, Naruto felt a tiny flare of pride. He hadn't taught her how to make a tailed beast bomb. This was every bit her. A stray spark shot past, scouring the ground to lash at his face. Blood sluiced down his cheek, lending his smile a crazed air. That's much better. His laughter rose against the wind. I can actually feel that. In a moment, old man, Saffron's growl was nothing short of feral. All you'll be feeling is defeat. That or disappointment. He took a bracing stance. Go ahead, kiddo. Flip that coin. Make your dad proud. ... Raw. Saffron screamed. And the world became so much light.